Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
When Gods Cross Paths. When Gods Cross Paths. Marac, from the roof of Percy's cabin, watched the brats bustling below with interest. Noisy, covered in dirt from head to toe. Some carried bows and amused themselves by shooting arrows at vines not far away, others practiced with swords. And there were even a few riding winged horses, performing clumsy and pompous maneuvers. The night he brought Percy here, just like the previous one, he hadn't noticed them. But now, Marac thought, they were truly annoying, as he looked down with disapproval at that so-called training that, to him, was nothing but garbage. If those kids could hear what Marac thought about their training, more than one of them would surely draw their sword to challenge him to a duel. But considering where Marac came from, it made sense. Sometimes, you had to break a few bones while training and fighting in camp. Garbage. Until you've endured every bone breaking in your body, you don't feel the thrill of life and death. And it was nothing that a couple of healing spells couldn't fix anyway. Of course, he kept those thoughts to himself. In truth, Percy had come out quite well. No broken bones, only a few strained tendons. Marac healed him before the boy even realized it. Perhaps that was why Percy was now stronger than any other kid in the camp. And to think Percy looked down on the camp for letting young people fight with real swords and get hurt. It was as if he hadn't realized how many times his own muscles and tendons had been strained from lifting heavy weights. But, well, that much was true. Marac's method of training was rather effective, throwing in healing spells every now and then while Percy remained unaware. That not only strengthened his endurance and power but also toughened his mind. The problem was that, being just a kid, his hormones sometimes took control. In serious cases, though, he was supposed to maintain the cold focus Marac had taught him. Then his gaze shifted to one of the tallest boys in the camp, well-built, walking with confidence, showing no visible weakness, the result of disciplined training. The others around him showed respect, his presence alone commanded it. Blonde hair, a friendly smile for everyone. Marac tilted his head slightly toward him. Trash, he muttered under his breath, spitting out the word before turning away with disdain. So, are you going to keep staring at me, or are you going to attack so I can have an excuse to destroy you on your own ground? Though honestly, I don't need one if I wanted to, said Marac, without even looking back. Behind him, the chubby Mr. D stood with an expression full of irritation and barely contained anger. This isn't a place for someone like you, said Mr. D with open contempt, as if he too were ready to fight. After all, it was his task, or punishment, to protect this place, to make sure that no outsiders who weren't demigods crossed into this territory, enemy or not. Someone like me, Marac repeated calmly before standing up, fixing his gaze on Mr. D. The god, being much shorter, forced Marac to look down at him. They were, in a way, perfect opposites. Mr. D was a short, plump man with round cheeks and a red nose, something between a cherub and a badly drawn caricature, with an unkempt beard that made him look even more ridiculous. Marac, on the other hand, wasn't dressed elegantly at all. He wore the same old jacket as always, but his muscles showed clearly through the fabric, especially when he exhaled like a warrior in control of his breath. His beard, however, was neatly trimmed. His pale blonde hair, pulled back in a Viking-style braid, glimmered under the sunlight, and his blue eyes shone with an intense, cold light as they fell upon the man before him. Between the two, the one who looked more like a true god was Marac, with his warrior's bearing and calm dominance. "And what will you do to drive me out?" asked Marac, a faint smile curling on his lips as his battle aura grew denser. "This is not your playground, foreigner. Your muscles and arrogance mean nothing here. This is my domain, and every blade of grass exists because I allow it," replied Mr. D, and the air around him seemed to thicken, as if he were stirring the very trees themselves. "Are you going to fight, or will you keep showing off your stupid pride?" said Marac calmly, his tone steady and unimpressed. The campers, who until then hadn't noticed that both figures stood on the roof of the cabin, finally felt it. They looked up and recognized their camp director, and the stranger standing defiantly before him. The tension between them felt like a storm ready to break at any moment. To be honest, many of them watched with great interest, wondering whether their director could actually hold his ground, especially when the man standing across from him looked anything but normal. Some even sided with the stranger. After all, their director wasn't exactly the most beloved person in camp. "Ooh, they're going to fight. Why didn't anyone tell me?" I'd love to see how this ends. Then I'll fight the winner, said a sudden voice that made both of them turn instantly. There, standing naturally like a colossal statue, was a huge Nordic warrior, muscular, towering, impossible to ignore. They noticed him the moment he spoke, his bright red hair and beard swayed with the wind, and his gaze held an amused interest in both opponents. "What are you doing here?" asked Mr. D, furious yet cautious at the same time, watching the figure who had appeared out of nowhere, someone who shouldn't even be able to set foot on his territory. I came to find my friend Marac. The old man found another one of those lizards for him," replied the newcomer with a calm smile, spinning his massive hammer between his fingers as if it were a simple wooden tool, despite its colossal size and the metallic hum it made as it moved. That's right, it was Thor. He had left the hotel from which he normally wasn't allowed to set foot outside. After all, he was a warhead who always caused trouble, but this time, it seemed Odin himself had sent him in search of Marac. Though, if he wanted to, the Allfather could have easily sent a message through his ravens as he often did. Still, something told Thor that this time Odin preferred to see him act in person. Meanwhile, the god of thunder examined the camp with genuine interest. The children stared at him wide-eyed, unable to comprehend that this giant of muscle and lightning had appeared among them without anyone noticing, even when everyone's attention had been fixed on Marac and Mr. D, seconds away from a potential clash. "Oh, Greek warriors," exclaimed Thor with an eager grin. "Do you wish to train with me?" he asked, spreading his arms wide, revealing his tense muscles and the gigantic hammer he wielded with insulting ease. Immediately, several campers ran off screaming incoherently or pretending they suddenly had urgent tasks elsewhere. It seems your warriors lack courage," said Thor, turning toward Mr. D, whose expression had grown more rigid. He looked at the thunder god with a mix of anger, distrust, and even slight fear, as if he were ready to summon all his brothers and sisters, and perhaps even his father, if the situation demanded it. "Oh, come now, drop that," said Thor with a casual wave of his hand. "I'm leaving anyway, I just came to get him," he said, pointing at Marac. "Unless, of course, you two plan to fight. In that case, I can wait," he added with a teasing smile. "I don't have time to behave like a barbarian," Mr. D retorted with disdain, turning away with a huff. Meanwhile, Marac raised his hand and cast a small spell that flew toward Percy, leaving behind a faint bluish glow. Then he turned away without looking back. "All right, let's go," he said with his usual calmness. "Want me to carry you?" asked Thor, resting the hammer on his shoulder with a grin. "There's no need," replied Marac. Mana gathered around his hands, and with a simple snap of his fingers, his body vanished in a surge of energy, leaving behind only a faint echo in the air. He had used a transportation spell. Thor glanced at Dionysus one last time, a faint, mocking laugh escaping him. Then, he raised his hammer, and his body transformed into a bolt of lightning that, instead of striking from the sky, shot upward toward it, disappearing among the clouds with a deafening roar. Mr. D remained for several seconds staring at the exact spot where the two men had stood, his face completely serious and his eyes narrowed. Finally, he sighed, turned around, and began to walk away, leaving behind the rooftop of the cabin and the restless murmurs of the campers who still didn't understand what had just happened. The weight of prophecies. Marac appeared at the entrance of the hotel, and a lightning bolt struck beside him at the same time, revealing Thor standing next to him. The timing was so perfect that it left no doubt about the power and speed of the thunder god, even if Marac had used teleportation. "Ha ha 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 ha, what a shame, I would have liked to fight that guy. They say one of his powers drives his enemies drunk with madness. I'd really like to see what he can do," said Thor as he entered through the main doors, his laughter echoing across the grand hall. Marac simply walked by his side. Thor's style, his attitude, and his very presence were unmistakably Nordic, so it wasn't hard to get along with him. Still, Marac didn't really have friends. He saw Thor as a rival he couldn't yet defeat, not yet. And yet, it seemed the thunder god had already accepted him as a friend without Marac even realizing it. "Oh, finally, you're here," said Odin, standing near the counter as he finished giving a few words to the Valkyrie at the reception. She quickly bowed and left, creating a subtle tension in the air. "That was interesting. I should go out more often," Thor commented with a relaxed grin. Odin looked at him but said nothing. In that moment, Thor seemed to catch a scent in the air. "Oh, looks like my liquor has arrived. See you later, Marac." Remember to stop by after you're done with that lizard. Let's see how strong you get this time, said Thor as he strolled casually down the hallway. People passing by greeted him respectfully, bowing their heads. Thor answered each with an easy smile, as if his divinity weighed less on him than his hammer did. Why did you send him? Asked Marac, turning toward Odin. After all, it made little sense for Thor to appear just in time to interrupt a potential fight with Mr. D. You know, even though you act so serious and cold, you're almost as impulsive as Thor, Odin replied calmly, watching him like an old man observing a stubborn child. Though, ironically, Marac was older than he appeared. Marac frowned at the remark, but before he could speak, Odin continued. You're not only putting yourself in danger, though I'm sure you'd survive, even if a little wounded, from a fight against Dionysus, god of wine, but have you thought about what could happen to your disciple? Right now, the leading god of his pantheon is looking for any excuse to send him on a one-way trip to the underworld. And it's not just because of you, but because of his father as well. Odin's voice grew heavier. Do you really think he wouldn't do it? He tried to kill his own brother's children once, and even murdered the man's mortal wife. What do you think would happen if one of his sons were hurt? It wouldn't be out of love, it would be out of pride, the pride of a pantheon's ruler. There are many things he could take advantage of, Marac. Many. The last words carried a hint of disdain before the god's tone returned to its usual calm. Marac raised an eyebrow. The information had taken him by surprise. To think that gods still acted with the honor of ancient warriors was foolish, truly foolish. Anyway, someone found out about your help to those brothers before. They want to hire you. It's amusing how there's now a kind of mercenary for gods with dragon problems forming, said Odin with a faint smile. Yet Marac could tell, the old man was hiding something. Not something that put him in danger, but rather something Odin was deliberately avoiding. Something connected to Marac himself. Again, Percy sighed as he read the letter that had appeared in his hand. It was from his teacher. The message said he had another job, so he'd be gone for a while. It ended with a typical Marac note, in the meantime, try not to die. Unless you want me to bring you back as a zombie. Percy remembered the mummy in the oracle's cabin and felt a shiver run down his spine. And I wanted to ask him what those different prophecies from the mummy even meant, he muttered while flipping through the notes he'd written down from memory. Now that he looked at them, they sounded like several different fates. Something completely strange, since Mr. Brunner, or rather, Chiron, had told him that prophecies only showed one path, one possible destiny. But Percy was sure he had heard 4 different oracles, something that didn't fit any of those rules. He knew Marac was wise, his master had told him he'd once been in a place where all knowledge gathered together. Even if he hadn't wanted it, he knew everything. Yet Percy often wondered if that knowledge might be a little off, since his teacher always seemed to ignore the most mundane things about this world. So I have to fight Hades, Percy said in annoyance. At that exact moment, he felt a sharp smack to the back of his head. When he turned around, Annabeth was there, staring at the ground with a wary look, as if she expected it to open up beneath her feet. Could you not say the names of every god out loud? Said Annabeth seriously. Right, I can't just say a random god's name before the thunder starts, Percy muttered irritably, rubbing the back of his neck. That girl, ever since the moment he met her, did nothing but annoy him. Sometimes he started to think they might have been enemies in a past life. Then something clicked in Percy's mind. According to Grover, Annabeth was the camper who had been at camp the longest. Hey, do you know anything about how someone who's supposed to be dead can come back to life? He asked, looking at her with curiosity. Annabeth looked at him like he was an idiot for several seconds. Are you talking about an archetype? She asked. Archie, what? Percy replied, confused. Archetype, that's what Chiron calls them. Those monsters, like the minotaur you killed, Annabeth explained with a sigh, rolling her eyes. What's wrong? You scared it's coming back for you? She added with a slight smirk. Percy immediately felt annoyed and turned around to leave, unwilling to keep arguing with her. Hey, shouted Annabeth, irritated at being left talking to herself. But Percy didn't stop or even glance back, which made her stomp her foot in frustration and spin sharply before storming off, her golden hair whipping through the air as she disappeared between the columns of the path. Percy had had enough. He'd gotten the answer he needed. Mrs. Dodds was alive, and she was a follower of a god, more precisely, a follower of Hades. And now he would have to go to the underworld to rescue his mother, and complete that stupid quest. It was more fun when everyone thought I was half crazy and my teacher made me train by lifting chests full of gold, Percy grumbled as he made his way toward the big house, determined to speak with Chiron. He had the prophecies written in his notes and needed to understand them, even if he didn't trust that teacher who pretended to be human just to keep an eye on him. With Marac gone, his only options were to search for information on his own, something that would likely lead nowhere, or let Chiron tell him everything, while pretending to agree, acting as if he had fully accepted his demigod fate. His master always told him, "You must be the one who keeps control of everything. Even if others think they have it, when your sword pierces their heart, they'll realize they were always the fools in your game." Bloody words, yes, but that was Marac's way. In just that 1 week at camp, Percy felt like he had matured faster than ever before. It wasn't that the camp had helped him, no. It was more like he could suddenly see things that had always been there, hidden, waiting for someone to remove the blindfold from his eyes. It was as if he were freeing himself from invisible chains, letting his thoughts flow, growing in his own way. He finally understood why Marac had never told him he was a demigod before. And he also realized that while he trained, his master had been killing monsters around him without his knowledge. He had noticed it the night even the camp was attacked by hellhounds. If those creatures could reach this place, what was the world outside like? Maybe, from the very day they met, Marac had been silently eliminating every monster that came near, protecting him without ever saying a word. Percy realized that the bond he felt with his master only grew stronger. In Marac, he saw the father figure he had never had, the one he had always needed. Harsh, demanding, but real. Of course, if he ever told Marac that, he'd probably end up training until he coughed up blood and his hands were raw. Or worse, he'd get beaten under the excuse of sword practice. So, for his own good, he'd keep that to himself. With those thoughts swirling in his head, Percy kept walking until he finally reached the place where he was supposed to meet Chiron. The chosen companions. "Hey, Jackson, looks like you're finally getting used to camp," said a blond boy as he approached with a confident smile. Percy looked up. He had just left the dining area and was heading toward the place where Chiron had told him to meet, where he would choose who would accompany him on his first quest. The boy's friendly tone made him pause for a moment, but not enough to let his guard down. Ever since he had arrived at Camp Halfblood and been assigned to the Hermes cabin, that boy, Luke Castellan, had been the first to approach him. Friendly, charismatic, with that natural charm that made people gravitate toward him. The kind of person who knew exactly how to win others over. And precisely because of that, Percy couldn't quite trust him. He had learned quickly that, in this place, respect was earned by breaking a few bones, not by smiling. He had proven it himself after several run-ins with the Ares kids, which ended with one of them in the infirmary and most of their bones fractured, in self-defense, of course. Luke, however, was different. Everyone respected him, even the more aggressive campers. That meant he was strong, influential, or both. And with people like that, Percy always saw more than they showed. As the blonde walked closer, Percy caught something behind that smile, a calculating look. It wasn't mere disinterest but something deeper. Contempt. He had seen it before, in his teacher Marac, that cold, distant expression that hid arrogance beneath a polite facade. So no, he wasn't buying that smile. "Hey, if you keep treating me like that, you'll hurt my feelings," Luke said in a light, teasing tone. "I'm only trying to be your friend." "Friend," Percy muttered, raising an eyebrow. For a brief second, he wondered if maybe he was overreacting. Maybe he'd gotten so used to being on guard that he saw enemies where there weren't any. He shook his head. "I'm fine, thanks," he replied, before quickening his pace. Luke watched him go, his smile slowly fading. In its place, a more serious, genuine expression appeared as his eyes followed the son of Poseidon's back. "Well then, Percy," said Chiron in a solemn tone, pacing in a slow circle around him. "It's your duty to choose your companions. Every mission outside camp is dangerous, and the rules state that 3 campers must go together. They'll be your team, you must trust them, and they must trust you. Choose wisely, danger lurks at every corner once you leave these borders." The centaur stopped in front of him, waiting. Around Percy, a group of the camp's best fighters stood in a loose circle, their faces full of barely contained excitement. Some smiled, others crossed their arms pretending to be calm, but all of them shared the same expectation, to be chosen. The thrill of adventure hung in the air, along with the chance to prove their worth to their divine parents, even if only to be noticed once. Percy studied them one by one. He recognized some faces, others not so much. All were warriors, sons and daughters of gods with unique talents. And yet, few inspired real trust. Truth be told, Percy hadn't been particularly sociable since arriving. He hadn't found much to like about this place so far. Among them, Annabeth stood tall and steady, her gray eyes locked on him with determination. There was something in her gaze that said, "Choose me," without a single word. Percy let out a small grimace. They'd had their fair share of clashes since his arrival, arguments about strategy, training methods, even ways of thinking. If there was one thing he couldn't deny, it was that the daughter of Athena was brilliant. Though, to be honest, she was also unbearably arrogant and knew exactly how to get under his skin. Even so, among everyone present, she was the most logical choice. Finally, he pointed in her direction. Annabeth. She barely contained the urge to jump for joy, limiting herself to a composed smile. For a moment, Percy couldn't help but think she looked kind of pretty. Chiron nodded approvingly. A good choice. Annabeth has proven herself to be intelligent and strategic when the situation demands it. Percy nodded silently, though deep down, something told him that this choice would bring both help and headaches. And now, Percy, your second choice, Chiron prompted. The boy glanced around. Do I have to choose one of the people here? He asked neutrally. Chiron blinked, a bit confused by the question. Elsewhere in the camp, where the stable stood, an unpleasant smell hung thick in the air. There, amid piles of straw and manure, a young satyr worked with visible disgust. Grover tried to maintain his composure as he shoveled the droppings left behind by the winged horses trotting freely across the fields. A few smaller foals played nearby, kicking up dust and other things. Grover sighed. And to think I studied so hard for this, he muttered with resignation. When Percy arrived, he found him talking to one of the winged horses as if the creature were his only confidant. Then Grover went back to work, wearing an expression of pure suffering. The son of Poseidon approached, frowning at the smell. Looks like you've got a lot of work. Grover turned around and forced a smile. And this is just one day's worth. Percy raised an eyebrow as he looked at the massive pile. I can see that. There was a brief silence. Grover lowered his gaze, uneasy. Ever since what had happened before, he hadn't known how to behave around Percy. Every time they were together, something dangerous seemed to happen. I thought you wouldn't want to see me, Grover said quietly, glancing at him. After all, you seem to avoid me every time I get close. The satyr tightened his grip on the shovel but didn't stop working, continuing to load the wheelbarrow. I won't lie to you, Percy said, his tone steady and sincere. I held a bit of a grudge. I thought you were my friend because you wanted to be, not because it was part of some mission. Grover looked at him, startled, unsure what to say. Percy, no, I mean, yeah, it was a mission to stay close to you, but no one told me I had to be your friend. That was my choice. Percy raised a hand to stop him. It's fine. Maybe I lumped everyone in camp together. I assumed everyone had some hidden agenda, and that ended up including you. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet honesty in it that was hard to ignore. Well, I guess it's better to have someone familiar than a complete stranger, he added. Grover frowned, confused. What are you talking about? Percy gave him a faint smile, that restrained one that always seemed to hide more than it revealed. Hope you've packed plenty of clothes. Grover stared at him wide-eyed, not quite understanding, until it clicked. What? No, don't tell me. Percy just kept smiling. Yet behind that smile was something else. His gaze shifted, serious, deep, analytical, the look of someone who observed and evaluated every detail, every reaction. It was an expression Grover would never understand, one that only a student of Marac could possess. You must be the one who keeps control over everything. Even if others believe they have it, when your blade pierces their hearts, they'll realize they were just pawns in your game. The words of his master echoed in Percy's mind as he silently assessed each of his choices. Hey, Jackson. Percy stopped at the sound of the voice and rolled his eyes in clear annoyance. He didn't need to look to know who it was. When he turned, he found Luke Castellan standing there, wearing his usual calm smile. What is it? You here to complain because I didn't pick you? Percy asked flatly, not bothering to hide his impatience. Of course not, Luke replied evenly. Though, to be honest, I was hoping to be chosen. Still, your choices weren't bad. Percy regarded him in silence for a moment. Part of him wanted to stay on guard, but another part wondered if he was overreacting. After all, Luke hadn't done anything truly suspicious, he just had that look. The one Percy had learned to recognize, the look of someone who calculated more than they let on. Even so, his friendly demeanor seemed genuine, and for a moment Percy felt a flicker of guilt for distrusting him so much. Well, Grover's my friend, after all. And you yourself said Annabeth's the best strategist, Percy said, lowering his defenses slightly. She is, Luke agreed with a nod. Don't worry, I get it. Really. Then, softening his tone, he added, just one thing, I've known Annabeth for a long time, so, take care of her, all right. In return, I'll give you this. From his bag, Luke pulled out a rectangular box and handed it to Percy. The boy took it with curiosity and opened it. Inside was a pair of sneakers, surprisingly modern and well-kept. When he lifted them out, small silver wings unfolded from the sides, fluttering lightly as if alive. My father gave them to me, Luke explained with restrained pride. They let you fly, but you're a son of Poseidon, and the sky isn't really your element. Maybe Grover could make better use of them. Percy arched an eyebrow as he examined the shoes, then glanced at Luke again, watching the delicate wings flap softly. It's just a little help for your quest, Luke added with a kind smile. After all, it's important to have every advantage you can. Percy studied him silently for a few more seconds, trying to read what lay behind that perfect expression. Finally, he nodded. I see, then I'll accept them. Luke's smile widened slightly. Glad to hear it. Good luck, Jackson. As the son of Hermes walked away, Percy continued to watch him quietly. There was something about that boy that didn't quite fit, something hidden beneath his easy smile and polite words. But for now, he said nothing. Threads beyond fate. It seems you have everything ready, said Chiron as he watched them with a mix of calm and pride. The three stood before him with their backpacks on their shoulders, or rather, Grover was the one carrying most of them. His pack was enormous, so loaded that it looked like it could crush him at any moment, and his neck was covered with necklaces of amulets, his inseparable reed pipes hanging among them. Still, what stood out the most was his expression, more nervous than Percy's and Annabeth's combined. Annabeth, on the other hand, had her bag slung across her shoulder and held a baseball cap in her hands. She looked at it with a kind of ritual seriousness, as if by gazing at it she was making a silent vow. Percy's expression appeared calm, though a faint flicker of anxiety betrayed his serenity. Not having Marac nearby unsettled him. Since the day before, his master had vanished without a trace, something that had happened before, but this time felt different. Perhaps he just longed for his presence, a way to confirm that everything would be fine as long as he was there. Take this, Percy. It will help you on your quest, said Chiron, handing him a pen. Percy looked at it with confusion. In his mind, he couldn't imagine how an ordinary pen would be useful on a journey that would take them all the way to the underworld itself. Chiron seemed to notice his doubt and, with a smile, added, uncap it. Percy obeyed. As soon as he removed the cap, the pen transformed into a celestial bronze sword that shone with a soft glow. Ancient Greek letters engraved along the blade gleamed with golden light, and the weapon fit perfectly in his hand, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Its name is Riptide, Chiron explained with a proud smile. It's special. You'll never lose it, it will always find its way back to you. It can only harm monsters, not humans, and its power comes directly from the sea. A weapon worthy of an ocean-born hero, perfect for you. Percy swung the sword curiously, watching his reflection in the blade. Not bad, almost as good as the one my master gave me. Though his has more enchantments, and it also returns to me, he said casually before turning it back into a pen and tucking it into his magic pouch, as if it were just another tool. Chiron's eyes widened, surprised by how casually Percy treated an artifact that most demigods would consider a priceless relic. Even Annabeth frowned slightly as she watched him. She was still holding her cap, a gift from her mother, Athena, as if it were an irreplaceable treasure. She shook her head in disapproval, thinking Percy didn't understand the true value of magical weapons, or of his mentor. She had heard rumors about him, but had never seen him in person, unlike Grover, who held a mix of respect and fear toward the man. Still, his nerves about leaving camp kept him distracted. Here, this will help, said Chiron, pulling out a paper envelope and handing it to Annabeth, ignoring the previous exchange. He knew she was the most sensible one to handle it. Inside were mortal money and a map, basic yet necessary tools for moving through the human world. Remember, he added gravely, this quest is important. You must recover the bolt before the summer solstice, or it will be too late to stop what's coming. The air grew heavy. Annabeth and Grover understood perfectly, but Percy barely heard him. His true mission was different. To him, this wasn't about a bolt or a war between gods. There was only one goal, to save his mother. And if he had to descend into the underworld to do it, he would, no matter who stood in his way. His gaze hardened, and Chiron recognized it instantly. It was the look of a hero accepting his fate. The three set out toward the edge of camp. When Annabeth crossed the boundary where the trees rose like a wall between the mortal and the divine worlds, she paused and looked at one in particular. That tree, now a silent guardian, reminded her what happened to those who failed. And at the same time, it fueled her resolve never to stray from her path. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in the most dangerous continent for a child of a god, an insane number of monsters roamed the streets as if they were ordinary humans. Some walked among them without hiding their fangs or glowing eyes. Others used weak illusions, just enough to blend in with the crowd. The number of mortals was overwhelmingly smaller compared to that of those creatures. They weren't just monsters from the Greek pantheon, there were also beings from other mythologies, drawn by the divine energy still lingering in the land left behind by the past. The result was such a massive concentration that if a single demigod set foot there, they would be devoured within seconds. In the middle of that chaos walked Marac, perfectly calm. His black jacket fluttered in the wind, and his sword, in his hand, vibrated occasionally, reducing to ashes any monster that came too close. It seemed as though he wasn't even moving his arm, or rather, no one could perceive the speed at which he struck. This place seems perfect to train the kid, he murmured with a faint smile. I should bring him here when I get the chance. Around him, the ground was covered with remains, horns, tails, claws, scales, and fragments of armor. Trophies from the monsters he had slain. Before killing each enemy, he often forced at least one of their materials to fall intact, always assessing whether it could serve him to forge new weapons or armor. His mission there was simple. A demigod was about to be born, the child of a minor god. Something unusual in those lands, especially among pantheons that preferred to keep their realms separate. Yet love, or foolishness, had overcome divine blood, and Marac, better than anyone, knew that such things never ended well. Sending the child to the western continent, of course, had been rejected. Not only because the monsters there were stronger, though fewer in number, accustomed to facing, day after day, the endless wave of Greek demigods who outnumbered all others combined. But also because such a move could ignite conflict among the minor gods themselves, or even with the greater ones, especially if the child happened to share any connection with the Greeks. From that, Marac understood one thing clearly: the other pantheons did not look kindly upon the gods of Olympus. Although, in truth, he didn't care. The only thing that mildly interested him was the supposed payment he would receive for his work. A man dressed in an elegant red suit and a turban appeared before him, his expression serene and his gesture full of sincere gratitude. "Thank you for coming from so far to help," said the stranger in a soft yet dignified voice. "I wish I could offer you more. After all, the one about to be born carries my blood. But we minor gods, we cannot interfere too much in mortal affairs." His tone carried a mix of guilt and resignation. He seemed calm, composed, but his words held an ancient weight. Marac regarded him in silence, one brow arching with mild curiosity. "And why is that?" he asked, his tone halfway between interest and boredom. The man sighed and replied evenly. "That is the problem when too many divinities share the same territory. All of them compete for faith. In ancient times, minor gods did everything they could to increase their power, blessing, cursing, meddling in mortal lives, sparking an invisible war for worship. And, as always, it was the humans who suffered the most." He paused for a moment, as if unwilling to continue. But Marac didn't seem interested in the conversation. He simply raised a hand and pointed toward the sky. A cascade of lightning burst from his palm like a radiant storm. In a matter of seconds, dozens of birds flying overhead disintegrated, reduced to shimmering dust. The man's eyes widened slightly, surprised by how effortlessly this being, who looked human but clearly wasn't, unleashed such power. "It'll only take about 10 minutes and 28 seconds, Marac murmured, observing the efficiency of the purge. Then he nodded to himself. "Though with this cleanup, you might not have to worry about anything else. When the child is born, I'll seal his divinity so no one can detect it until he reaches maturity." The god spoke with calm assurance, preparing to depart. Yet before disappearing, he gave Marac one last look. It wasn't a simple glance. For a brief instant, it seemed as though he were peering deep into him, examining his very essence. A faint surprise crossed his face before, with a flick of his sleeve, he tossed a small vial toward him. Marac caught it midair. Inside, a golden liquid shimmered brightly, radiating a tangible divine energy. He studied it with interest for a few seconds, then tucked it carefully into a secure compartment of his cloak. "HMPH. That brat will kneel before me when I hand him this," he muttered with a barely perceptible smile. Then he inhaled deeply, gathering an immense surge of energy within his chest. Since everything was finished, he thought it was time to clean the area, completely. "Strun ba qo," he roared to the heavens. The power of the word thundered through the air like the roar of 1,000 storms. At that instant, Marac felt multiple divine gazes fall upon him, vast and distinct presences belonging to different pantheons. All of them shared something in common, a blend of attention, fury, and curiosity. The wind turned wild. The clouds began to spiral above his head, heavy with crackling electricity. But Marac did not flinch. With complete composure, he activated his teleportation magic and vanished, just before a colossal tempest erupted across the land. The sky roared. Bolts of lightning fell like spears of fire, annihilating every monster that dared approach. The ground quaked, the rain crashed down with overwhelming force, and within minutes, every trace of the abominations had been reduced to ashes. Meanwhile, the man in the red suit had returned to a small secluded house, where an exhausted woman smiled softly, holding in her arms a newborn crying with all his strength. Sweat glistened on her forehead, but her eyes shone with relief and tenderness. She looked out the window, unaware that the god stood beside her, watching the same scene. The man fixed his gaze on the horizon as his voice resonated with a calm, almost philosophical tone. "A being so powerful, greater than the minor gods, second only to the great ones. How long can he remain so free?" he murmured thoughtfully. His eyes glowed briefly, as if glimpsing something beyond the present. Then he smiled. "It seems my gamble wasn't so bad after all. If not even the fates can find his path, it means his destiny will be written by his own hand." He spoke with the serenity of one who had seen countless futures. For the first time in ages, his face reflected a pure emotion, expectation. To witness something that escaped the control of destiny was fascinating. As the woman cradled her child, a boy who should not exist, who by all logic should have died an hour ago, the god felt, for the first time, that something truly unpredictable had occurred. And that simple fact filled him with hope. The child would live. His life would not be bound to the thread of fate, but to the power of his own choices. And for a god who had seen everything, that was truly exhilarating. The long road west. Los Angeles, Percy asked with mild surprise as he walked alongside his two quest partners through the forest. Naturally, Annabeth replied in that tone she used whenever she thought something was so obvious it should be common knowledge. "Oh, right, naturally." Percy nodded as if he had just remembered, though the sarcasm in his voice was so clear even Grover frowned. Then he sighed, looking resigned. "So we'll have to find a way to get all the way to Los Angeles, underage, broke, and without being able to take a plane because Mr. Lightning Bolt might get bored and shoot one down for fun." The irritation in his voice was impossible to miss, though it wasn't clear if he was more annoyed about the trip itself or about the capricious god forcing them to take the longest possible route just to retrieve his lost toy. Grover flinched at the way Percy spoke about Zeus so casually. The sky seemed to respond at once. A distant rumble echoed above them, as if the god himself had been listening from the moment Percy set foot outside Camp Halfblood. Percy tilted his head up, tempted to yell something like, yeah, I hear you." But Grover quickly grabbed his arm before he could commit divine stupidity. Annabeth, meanwhile, looked at him with a mix of annoyance and disapproval, as if having him on the team was more of a burden than an advantage. Percy, however, seemed more focused on watching the sky than arguing with her, as though he were checking for something. "Remember, seaweed brain," Annabeth said sharply. "Athena isn't exactly fond of Poseidon. I'm just trying to keep you from getting fried by a lightning bolt, so maybe stop tempting fate and move faster." "You know," Percy said with a crooked grin, "we're still close to camp. If you don't like my company, I'm sure there's another child of some god available. Plenty of them looked excited to prove themselves, though I couldn't care less. Annabeth's face turned red, whether from anger or embarrassment Percy couldn't tell. Just keep walking, she snapped, speeding up with heavy, irritated steps. Percy, on the other hand, continued calmly, quietly savoring his small victory. Grover remained a bundle of nerves. Every time Percy and Annabeth exchanged words, the poor satyr seemed to age a year. As they advanced among the trees, Percy finally decided to check the items they had been given at camp, something he hadn't done before, perhaps because he'd been too busy picking his dream team, or because part of him still worried they might run into another horde of monsters like the one Marac had destroyed days before Percy's arrival at camp. Yet that day, the forest was peaceful. Too peaceful. As if that earlier ambush had been something special, or maybe, a test planned by someone. Percy pulled out a small cloth pouch from his bag. Inside, he found glowing cubes of food and small portions of golden liquid. So this is ambrosia and nectar, he murmured with interest. Idiot, put that away, Annabeth scolded, alarmed. That's god food. If a mortal ate or drank it by mistake, they'd be vaporized instantly. We're only supposed to use it in emergencies, to heal serious wounds. Percy looked at her calmly, then sealed the pouch without a word and tucked it back into his bag. He pulled out another smaller one next, filled with large golden coins roughly the size of cookies. Gold? He asked curiously. Drachmas, Grover explained, nodding eagerly. They're used for non-mortal transactions. Percy examined them closely. There were about 20. What cheapskates, he said with a teasing smile. Cheapskates? That's a lot, Grover exclaimed, almost offended. After all, he knew better than anyone how tight the camp's budget really was. Percy slipped the coins back into his magic bag and, with complete nonchalance, took out a piece of dried meat and began chewing as they walked. Grover sniffed the air, surprised. The aroma wasn't that of ordinary jerky, it smelled like a freshly grilled steak, the kind of meal one only got to taste once a year, if lucky. His eyes fixed on Percy with a mix of curiosity and horror, more out of respect for nature than hunger. Percy noticed the look and offered him the piece with a puzzled expression. No, I don't eat meat, Grover said quickly, almost offended. You should know that. We went to the same school. I always gave you my meat portions, and you gave me your vegetables. Percy smirked. To be fair, I still think that whole arrangement was a scam. Maybe you're not as vegetarian as you claim. Grover opened his mouth to reply, then just sighed in defeat. Annabeth, a few steps ahead, pretended not to listen, though it was obvious her patience was hanging by a thread. Percy kept chewing his meat with that same calm, provoking attitude that was so characteristic of him. Each bite seemed to melt away the fatigue in his muscles until, without even realizing it, he felt completely full. He walked in silence, a faint warmth spreading through his body, a sensation he recognized as the effect of that strange meat. According to Marac, it was highly nutritious. Percy didn't fully understand what that meant, but he could feel the results. His energy didn't drop, and even after hours of walking, he felt neither hunger nor exhaustion. Although, if he was honest, he wasn't entirely sure it really was dragon meat. Still, it was delicious. So good that, if he hadn't filled up so fast, he would have kept eating until he burst like an overinflated balloon. The strange part was that once he reached a certain point, his desire to eat vanished completely, as if his body itself refused to let him take another bite. He then remembered the times his master had shared parts of his meals during training. Marac always cooked in the forest, using ingredients Percy preferred not to ask about. Even so, the results were always impressive, simple, rustic dishes, but incredibly flavorful, and each with a different effect depending on the type of meat. Once, after a particularly brutal training session that had left him completely shattered, his master had given him a stew made from an animal whose shape Percy would rather not remember. The only thing he'd recognized was what looked like a rodent's tail. As unpleasant as it sounded, that stew had cured all his muscle pain and restored his stamina almost miraculously. His body had continued regenerating for hours afterward. So yes, Percy wasn't exactly picky about the food his master gave him. He knew, in a way, that it was magical. Or maybe he just wanted to believe that, so he didn't have to consider the possibility that he'd eaten a giant rat. It has to be dragon. Definitely a dragon, obviously, Percy muttered to himself, half convinced, eyeing the remaining piece of meat suspiciously, as if searching for a long tail hidden among the scraps. Annabeth and Grover glanced at him sideways but decided not to ask. "Tell me something," Percy said after a while, breaking the silence with a tone of complaint. "Don't you have, like, a camp bus or a magic cart or something to travel with? We've been walking for hours." It was true. The forest was thinning out now, giving way to a straight road lined with trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches, and although Percy appeared calm, the surroundings made him uneasy. The last time he had been in a forest, he'd ended up facing a minotaur, wearing underwear. Not a pleasant memory. "Yes, we did have transportation," Annabeth replied, sounding both irritated and tired. "But someone decided to annoy Mr. D, and he banned us from using it." She frowned, adding, "Though he also said something about keeping you on solid ground in case a certain unwanted individual decided to show up." Percy slowly turned his head toward Grover. After all, he was the one who worked cleaning the stables of the Pegasi. And if anyone had managed to irritate the director, it was probably the guy stuck with that kind of job. "It wasn't me," Grover blurted out, waving his hands nervously. "I swear." Percy raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The road stretched on for several more hours before the three of them finally reached the city. The air grew heavier, and the sound of cars replaced the birdsong. They headed straight toward the bus terminal. Annabeth and Grover were drenched in sweat, breathing heavily. Percy was sweaty too, but more from the heat than from the effort. His endurance was clearly far greater, and he didn't hesitate to credit his master, and the mysterious dragon meat, as he kept calling it. The taste still lingered in his mouth, and as he watched his companions panting, he couldn't help but think that maybe he should have offered them a little. After all, if it really was dragon meat, or whatever it was, they could at least share the mental burden of that possible culinary trauma. Well, at least Annabeth could. Grover didn't eat meat. Then again, the satyr did eat soda cans and bits of metal. What a weird metabolism, Percy thought, shaking his head as they approached the ticket counter to buy their passes. The road ahead, phew, we made it alive. So many miles and not a single monster trying to eat us, said Percy with a grin as he looked at the tickets in Annabeth's hands. At those words, Annabeth frowned, visibly irritated, before glaring at him. "Don't say things like that, seaweed brain. It's bad luck." Percy looked at her calmly. "Remind me again, why do you hate me so much?" he asked with complete ease. "I don't hate you," she said softly. "Well, you almost fooled me," replied Percy with a touch of sarcasm. Annabeth, holding her cap in her hands, folded it slightly and squeezed it before speaking. "Look, it's just that we're not supposed to get along," she admitted after a moment. "Our parents are rivals." "Huh, why?" asked Percy, genuinely confused. "Oh, how many reasons do you want?" Annabeth snapped, clearly losing patience. She sighed and then looked at him with a more serious expression. "Once, my mother caught Poseidon with his girlfriend in one of Athena's temples. That alone was deeply disrespectful. And another time, Poseidon and Athena competed to become the patron of the city of Athens. Your father made a stupid saltwater spring as a gift, while my mother created the olive tree. People saw that her gift was more useful and named the city after her," she explained, in her usual intellectual tone. "Wow, she must really like olives," said Percy, completely missing the point. Annabeth let out a frustrated growl, her face tightening in annoyance before sighing again. "Forget it," she muttered and hurried toward the parked bus. Percy watched her walk away, amused, before calling after her with a grin. "I mean, if she had created pizza instead, that would have been a real gift." "I said forget it," Annabeth shouted back, turning with fiery eyes before walking even faster to get away from him. Grover just sighed tiredly before following both of them. As Percy was about to step onto the bus, something caught his eye. A poster on a nearby pole showed his own face in large print. The words, "Have you seen this boy?" were written in bold letters. His eyes widened as he quickly tore the flyer down before anyone else could see it. Reading the small text beneath, he muttered quietly, "Missing person. Possible witness to the disappearance of Gabe Ugliano and Sally Jackson," followed by a police contact number. "Great," Percy said with irritation. It made sense that they were looking for him. His mom had vanished, and his stepfather too, both on the same day he was sent to camp. The police had no way of knowing where he'd gone, and now they probably thought he had something to do with his mother's disappearance. The idea alone made his stomach twist. He realized they weren't far from his old neighborhood. That explained why the poster was here. Around this time, His mom would usually be finishing work and heading home. Gabe would be there too, playing cards, pretending not to care, just waiting for money to waste on his bets. But everything had changed thanks to his master. Gabe wouldn't bother his mother ever again, and Percy himself would make sure to save her, to give her the peaceful life she deserved, as peaceful as possible, considering her son was a demigod. You know why she married him, Percy? Grover suddenly asked, catching him slightly off guard. What? You can read minds now, Percy replied, narrowing his eyes suspiciously. Only emotions, Grover said calmly. Didn't I tell you, satyrs can do that? You didn't tell me a lot of things, Grover. Not that I'm surprised, Percy muttered with mild sarcasm. Grover ignored the remark and continued. She married him because of you. You call him Smelly Gabe, but that's an understatement. That man has an aura that's, bleg. I can still smell it on you even now, and you haven't been near him for a long time. Thanks, Percy replied flatly. You should actually be grateful, Grover went on. Your stepfather smelled so disgustingly awful that his stench masked your demigod scent completely. I realized it the day we met in the car. Gabe's presence hid your essence for years. If you hadn't lived with him every summer, the monsters would have found you long ago. Your mom stayed with him to protect you. She was smart, and she really loved you to put up with that guy. For what it's worth, she did it all for you. Percy looked away, his expression cold. That's not much of a comfort, he said quietly. For a moment, his demigod aura seemed ready to flare up, the air around him tense with restrained anger. Then he exhaled slowly, rubbing his face before forcing a more neutral look. But, it just gives me one more reason to finish this quest. My quest, he murmured. Then a familiar scent reached him. He stopped, sniffed the air, and his eyes softened. It was a known aroma, warm and comforting, one that brought back a sense of security. For the first time in a long while, he smiled genuinely. That faint trace reminded him that he had something behind him, something that gave him strength to keep moving forward. With an authentic, renewed smile full of energy, Percy ran toward the bus, ready to continue the journey. Meanwhile, standing atop the roof of the ticket office building, Marac calmly watched the movement of the crowd below. His silhouette stood out against the sky. He wore his black jacket, the one with the image of a skeleton on the back and the word, death, written beneath it. The fabric swayed slightly in the breeze, giving him an air that was both relaxed and menacing. His eyes focused on the bus where Percy was boarding, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile formed on his face. It seems the boy's senses are improving, he murmured, his voice carrying a restrained note of pride. But he shouldn't get too confident. I won't interfere, I want to see how he handles himself. If he doesn't meet my expectations, he'll have to endure the infernal training I've prepared. His words faded into the city noise as he continued watching the vehicle. Then, his gaze shifted toward a pair of women walking through the crowd. There was something off about them, they moved with too much precision, like predators among distracted prey. They seemed to be searching for something, or someone. Marac observed them for a moment longer, showing no apparent interest, before sitting down on the edge of the roof. With complete composure, he pulled a can of beer from his pocket. It was the same one he had been given as a reward for his first mission in this world. He held it between his fingers for a moment, vaguely recalling that event, then opened it with a sharp metallic click. Immediately, a thick, intoxicating aroma spread through the air. The scent was so strong it seemed to travel for kilometers. People walking below stopped in their tracks, glancing upward in confusion. Some closed their eyes and inhaled deeply, overcome by a strange sense of calm. Their bodies relaxed, their expressions softened, and a few even began to laugh for no reason, stumbling as if drunk. Marac studied the golden liquid inside the can with mild curiosity, watching the bubbles move lazily. Definitely beer, he muttered quietly before drinking it down in a single motion. The liquid vanished so quickly that a single breath was enough to empty it. Not bad, he said with approval, nodding slightly. He crushed the can in one hand, reducing it to a crumpled piece of metal. When he was about to throw it away, he paused, his gaze sharpening on the material. Something about it caught his attention. After a few seconds of inspection, he slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket, right where he kept his magic pouch. Then his eyes returned to the bus already driving away, a faint spark of interest glinting within them. The wind played with his hair and the hem of his jacket, and though he said nothing else, his mere presence made the air around him feel heavier. Marac remained there, silent and patient, like someone who already knew the outcome but still wanted to see how fate would unfold on its own, before he suddenly disappeared with a faint murmur, his body dissolving into mist. Ashes, lightning, and shadows. Percy boarded the bus with his companions just before the last passengers got on. They were three nearly identical old women, dressed in the same outdated clothes and wearing hats so bright they were almost grotesque. Each had a different color, but that wasn't the disturbing part. What truly made Percy freeze was the face of the woman in the middle. He knew that face. He would never forget it. "Mrs. Dodds," he muttered, his voice steady but filled with disbelief, shock, and restrained fury, as if ready to lunge at her the moment he saw her. Grover grabbed his arm nervously to stop him. Percy shot him an irritated look, though he eventually accepted it. He dropped into his seat, eyes never leaving the three old women, who smiled mockingly at him before sitting just behind the driver. "I thought you said that when they die, they're expelled for almost a lifetime," said Percy, his gaze fixed on the back of Mrs. Dodds's head. "I said if you were lucky," Annabeth replied quickly. She was tense too. After all, what stood before them were the furies of Hades. "And clearly, you're not," she added with a grimace, as if blaming Percy for their bad luck. Grover swallowed hard. "All three of them are here," he whispered, on the verge of hyperventilating. "It's fine," Annabeth said softly, trying to stay calm. "We just need to find an opportunity, maybe jump out the window or through the emergency exit." "The windows are sealed, and there's no emergency exit," Grover stammered, his face growing paler by the second. Annabeth tried to think fast, searching for a way out, but time wasn't on their side. Mrs. Dodds rose from her seat with an almost theatrical air and announced, "I have to go to the restroom." Her voice sounded perfectly normal to the mortals, who saw nothing more than an ordinary elderly lady. "Me too," said the second. "And me," added the third. The three began walking slowly toward the back of the bus. Nervousness spread between Annabeth and Grover, while Percy's expression turned cold and determined. His hand slipped inside his bag, revealing the black hilt of a sword barely visible in the shadows. Tap, tap, tap. A dull sound caught his attention, like something falling to the floor. Ignoring his companion's panic, he looked down. At his feet were three dark stones. No, not stones. They were massive gems, each the size of a hand, radiating a sinister glow. Their polygonal, uneven surfaces looked like roughly cut prisms. They were as black as obsidian, but faint purple reflections swirled within, like smoke or living energy trapped inside the crystal. Percy frowned, confused. He crouched, picked up the gems, and placed them in his bag, deciding to examine them later. "Here, take this, Percy. You need to hide and get out," Annabeth said suddenly, shoving her Yankees cap in front of him, her eyes full of determination. Percy blinked, caught slightly off guard, then glanced down at the cap. "And what about you two?" he asked seriously. "We'll be fine. They're after you. Maybe they won't even attack us if they can't see you. Now put it on," Annabeth insisted. A faint glint passed through Percy's eyes before he nodded. He looked at her once more and then slipped on the cap. In an instant, his body vanished. Annabeth and Grover could no longer see him, though their faces showed deep worry and resignation. They both knew Percy was far more important to the quest than either of them. The three Furies drew closer, only a few meters away now. Their bodies began to twist and change, their skin cracked and darkened, revealing beneath it a texture like burning ash, gray streaked with glowing red veins like living embers. From their backs burst massive, bony bat-like wings. Their eyes turned a feral yellow, and their mouths opened unnaturally wide, revealing curved fangs and a forked tongue. In their hands appeared whips of fire and shadow, crackling as if forged from pure hatred. Mrs. Dodds took the lead, but just then, she heard a sharp hiss beside her, like the sound of air being sliced apart. She turned, her eyes widening in shock and fear. A black sword was hurtling toward her neck. Percy appeared out of nowhere, his cap pushed just enough to reveal his face. His eyes blazed with fury, and the strength behind his strike was meant to decapitate her in a single blow. For a brief instant, Mrs. Dodds smiled mockingly. The blade didn't look like normal steel, she believed it couldn't harm her. But her smile vanished immediately. The sword touched her neck, and a surge of lightning tore through her body. Blue sparks and blazing fire erupted around her, merging with a cold so deep it seemed to freeze her very blood. It was like being burned, electrocuted, and frozen all at once. For an endless second, everything spun. The last thing she saw was her own body falling headless to the floor, and Percy standing before her, sword still glowing with a dark light. The metallic sound of something being cut echoed loudly. The bus shook violently as part of its frame was sliced open like paper under the force of the attack. Passengers screamed while a section of the roof tore apart, smoke and panic filling the air. Percy remained standing, eyes cold and expression unreadable, watching as the woman's head, the one who had likely taken his mother, fell to the floor before dissolving into dust. His black sword shone faintly, as if absorbing the remains, before expelling them toward his bag. Percy felt a slight tug on the strap, sensing a strange connection between it and the dark stones he had collected earlier. The bus erupted into chaos. The driver fought to regain control, passengers screamed and stumbled, but Percy stood still, his calm almost unnerving, his eyes fixed on the spot where Mrs. Dodds had fallen. Without saying a word, he reached into his bag and pulled out a golden pen. With a swift twist, he uncapped it, a second sword appeared in his hand, identical to the first, yet gleaming like sunlight itself. Now armed with both, he raised his gaze toward the Furies. There was no fear in his eyes, only determination and a thirst for vengeance. Yet, despite everything, his expression remained under control. Percy, Grover murmured, uneasy at the coldness he had never seen in his friend before. Percy didn't answer. He didn't even turn around. He simply pushed off the ground and launched himself toward the nearest Fury, aiming Anaklusmos directly at her neck. The creatures froze for a moment, paralyzed between fear and disbelief. They had just watched their sister's soul get absorbed by the boy's black sword and then expelled into that strange bag at his waist. But they recovered quickly. Their whips burst into dark flames as they attacked in unison. Percy swung his black sword, deflecting part of the strike without halting the motion of Anaklusmos. The whips wrapped around the black blade, and instantly began to freeze. One of the Furies leapt back to dodge, barely escaping, feeling the edge graze her neck. Percy twisted his wrist sharply, shattering the frozen whips into 1,000 shards, then brought down a powerful vertical slash. The Fury who had thought she was safe was cleaved cleanly from head to toe. Her body disintegrated and was absorbed by the black sword, which once again expelled her essence into Percy's bag. The impact was so fierce that the bus's roof tore open, and a diagonal slash shattered the front windshield. The driver screamed, struggling to regain control as the vehicle shook violently. The last Fury realized she had no chance. That boy wasn't an ordinary demigod. His weapons were something else, something that shouldn't exist. In fear and desperation, she turned sharply and leapt through the shattered windshield, beating her wings frantically to flee at high speed. Percy followed her with his eyes, his breathing steady. Then he raised Anaklusmos as if it were a spear. "Ah!" he shouted, gathering all his strength. His muscles tensed, veins bulging along his arms as he hurled the sword with almost inhuman force. The weapon flew through the air like lightning, piercing the Fury mid-flight. A flash streaked across the sky before her body dissolved into dust. Unlike the others, her essence wasn't absorbed, it simply scattered, as if refusing to be taken. Then the out-of-control bus veered off and slammed into a tree by the roadside. The impact hurled passengers against the seats and shattered several windows. Percy grabbed one of the side rails to keep himself from being thrown out. He waited a few seconds, took a deep breath, and then picked up the golden pen again, clicking it shut before tucking it into his bag. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing all the anger and bitterness that had driven him to attack. Then he turned toward his companions, who were staring at him with wide eyes and open mouths. "Looks like we won't be getting any farther on this bus," he said calmly. He paused briefly, then added matter-of-factly, "Oh, by the way, you might want to adjust your cap a little, it came off while I was moving." Annabeth stared at him, torn between laughing and screaming, as Percy handed her back the Yankee's cap. In the distance, dark clouds began to gather, and thunder rumbled across the sky. The air grew heavy, charged with electricity. It was as if the very heavens were furious. Percy looked up just as he felt a sharp kick to his back. "What the?" he managed to say before his body was sent flying out of the bus, hitting the grass with a hard thud. Grover and Annabeth landed beside him, just as dazed, while people screamed and ran for their lives. A second later, a lightning bolt fell from the sky, striking the bus dead center. Boom! The explosion was deafening. Flames engulfed the vehicle, turning it into a blazing inferno of smoke and fire. What was that?" Grover stammered, still in shock. "Who pulled us out of the bus?" Annabeth asked, staring at the flames in disbelief. Percy smirked faintly despite the pain in his backside from the kick. His gaze drifted toward the stormy sky, as though expecting another strike at any moment. "We'd better get going," he said quickly, urging his companions to move. Both nodded, still sore from their falls, and started running with him toward the nearby forest. As fire truck sirens wailed in the distance and bystanders recorded the flames with their phones, a figure began to emerge from the heart of the blaze. Gasps and screams erupted among the witnesses, astonishment and fear blending in equal measure. A man stepped calmly out of the fire, completely unharmed. His expression was serene, almost bored. His eyes swept across the scene until they fixed on the direction where Percy and the others had fled. Then he looked up at the sky, as if challenging whoever had cast the lightning. Marac smiled faintly, a calm, mocking smile full of defiance. The sky roared again, though the bolts now seemed restrained, as if something unseen was holding them back. With unhurried steps, Marac began walking toward the forest. For a moment he stopped, glancing down at his hands. This feeling, perhaps it's from that drink. I feel slightly drunk, he said casually. He shrugged, unconcerned, and continued walking among the trees, the raging fire behind him illuminating the night. The Garden of Stone Shadows Part 1. Our money, food, and clothes, murmured Grover sadly, complaining softly. After all, their backpacks had been inside the bus that had gone up in flames. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Well, maybe if someone hadn't decided to join the fight, said Annabeth irritably, glancing to her side, where Percy was supposed to be walking. Yet with so much darkness around them, she could barely make out his silhouette. Crunch, crunch, crunch. To be honest, I'm not complaining. They could have killed us, said Grover softly, raising a hand. You don't have to protect me, snapped Annabeth, slightly annoyed. I would have managed on my own. We'd have ended up in pieces, Grover replied. Shut your mouth, goat boy, said Annabeth, exasperated. Crunch, crunch, crunch. What the hell is that sound? Percy, are you eating something? Asked Annabeth, turning her irritation toward her other companion, who, for some reason, was suspiciously quiet. Before getting closer, all she could hear was the rain hitting the ground and smell the humid forest air. She could hardly see a thing, but when she moved nearer, almost face to face, she finally saw what he was doing. Percy was calmly eating strips of jerky. The smell was so delicious that, being so close, Annabeth couldn't help but feel hungry. Want some? Offered Percy, pulling a piece of jerky from his bag. Annabeth's expression shifted through several colors and emotions in mere seconds. Yet her stomach gave a small growl, betraying her. With an irritated tug, she snatched the piece from his hand and bit into it fiercely, glaring at him as if she were biting his face instead. A moment later, her expression softened. The meat was delicious, warm, rich in flavor, restoring her energy and washing away her fatigue. She couldn't believe something like this existed. Any meat she'd eaten before now felt like garbage in comparison. Now she understood why Percy had seemed so energetic while they were walking to the bus stop. Back then she had refused to try it because he'd insisted it was dragon meat, which she'd obviously thought impossible. But now, she wasn't so sure. A glint crossed Percy's eyes as he thought to himself, even if it's not dragon meat and my teacher lied to me, at least I won't be the only one suffering. He was still a little haunted by the thought of what he'd eaten. Even though it really was dragon meat, he refused to believe it completely unless he saw a dragon being cooked right in front of him. He trusted his teacher, just not when it came to food. He'd still eat it, of course, but the psychological damage was inevitable. Great, you guys have food, but my cans, groaned Grover sadly. Too bad for you for being a vegetarian. Maybe we can find some grass for you, Percy added after swallowing another bite. Grover grumbled angrily and quickened his pace. The three trudged through muddy terrain, surrounded by trees swaying in the rain. The mud clung to their sandals and shoes, and the constant sound of water dripping on leaves filled the air. At least Annabeth and Percy, having eaten, still had strength to continue. Grover, however, looked more and more exhausted. Perhaps feeling a bit grateful for the food Percy had shared, Annabeth walked a little closer to him, her expression serious but softer. Look, I appreciate your help, okay. You were really brave, and those attacks of yours were powerful, she said quietly, almost in a whisper, as if saying, thank you, physically hurt. Percy glanced sideways, trying to see her face through the darkness. We're teammates, right? He replied calmly. It's just that, if you die, aside from the fact that you obviously wouldn't like that, this quest would be over. And this might be my only chance to see the real world, she added. The rain began to ease. Percy caught a glimpse of her blonde hair glinting faintly, her face showed mild surprise. You haven't left camp since you were 7? Percy asked, confused. No, I've only gone on a few short trips, Annabeth admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. My dad, well, living with him at home didn't work out. The squelching of their footsteps in the mud filled the silence between them. That's why Camp Halfblood is my home. You train and train there, and that's fine. But the monsters are out here, she continued. In the real world, that's where you find out if you're really worth something. You're brave, said Percy calmly. You think so? Asked Annabeth quickly, a flicker of emotion in her voice. You were willing to face a fury without your most precious cap. That says a lot, Percy said, watching her through the darkness. He couldn't see her face completely, but he knew she was smiling. Thanks, Annabeth whispered. That's it, murmured Percy, noticing a few neon lights in the distance. Sniff, sniff, Grover began to smell the air, his expression almost blissful. Annabeth and Percy sensed it too, even without enhanced senses, the smell of fried food was unmistakable. Although Percy and Annabeth were already full thanks to the dragon meat, they felt relieved at the thought that maybe they could get something for their companion. The three quickened their pace until they reached what seemed to be a brightly lit shop, decorated with stone statues. There were garden gnomes in various poses, some waving with strange smiles. Among them were also statues of people, and Grover stopped, his eyes widening as he saw one that looked eerily like a satyr. That looks like my Uncle Ferdinand, he murmured with a shiver. It's fine, let's just ask if they can sell us some food and keep moving, said Percy calmly, unaware of the danger lurking among the stone shadows. But the money, said Grover worriedly. After all, the money had been in Annabeth's backpack, which was still on the bus. The money the camp gave us might be gone, but I still have mine, said Percy, pulling a wad of bills from his bag. After all, Marac had exchanged some gold for cash, and Sally had helped with the purchase of certain supplies his teacher needed. She had also given Percy a bit of extra money, taken from the jewelry Marac had let them keep, just in case. Grover and Annabeth both widened their eyes at the sight of the bills. Percy, meanwhile, felt for a moment like a rich kid, waving the money in the air and wondering if he could use it to slap some fool who thought he was better than everyone else. He chuckled at the thought, his teacher would probably smack him on the head if he saw him acting like that. Sometimes Percy suspected that Marac thought he had some kind of problem, and to be honest, Percy knew he had several. Besides dyslexia and ADHD, there was the little detail of living surrounded by monsters. Meanwhile, he looked up at the neon sign in front of the shop, barely able to make out what it said. What does the sign say? Percy asked, turning to Annabeth, who usually spent all her time reading architecture books. I don't know, admitted Annabeth, embarrassed. She was also dyslexic, and the reason she read that book she loved so much was precisely to practice her reading. Auntie M's Garden Gnome Emporium, Grover read aloud for both of them. At that very moment, the shop's door opened gently, releasing a warm draft that smelled of oil and fried food. A woman stepped out, or at least, something shaped like a woman. Her entire body was covered by a dark outfit that didn't show a single inch of skin, except for her hands, slightly wrinkled, suggesting she was quite old. Her face was hidden behind a black veil, so thick that not even her eyes were visible. It was impossible to tell how she could see through it. Oh, children, she said in a surprised voice, looking at the three of them. Percy watched her silently and frowned, almost imperceptibly. There was something strange about her. He didn't know exactly what it was, but his instincts, the same ones he had learned never to ignore since discovering the world of monsters, were screaming that something wasn't right. What are you doing here so late? Asked the woman in a tone of apparent concern. And your parents? She added, glancing around. Percy tried to push away the uneasy feeling, convincing himself that maybe he was developing some kind of post-traumatic stress. He didn't want to live paranoid, seeing monsters behind every shadow. The Garden of Stone Shadows, Part 2 inches. Hello, sorry to bother you, Percy began calmly. We got separated from our tour group from the circus. We went into the woods to collect firewood, but it seems we took a wrong turn and ended up lost for hours. Could you sell us some food and maybe a flashlight to light the way? We'd like to find our group before they leave without us. The smell of fried food wafting from inside the shop was so strong it almost made him forget the lie he had just improvised. He could feel Annabeth's burning glare on his back, clearly furious with his creative story, but Percy knew it was best to grab something quickly and leave. After all, the three Furies he had fought could return at any moment, or at least one of them. He was sure the first two were trapped inside the gems he'd found. Earlier, when he'd looked at them, he had noticed a faint dark aura glowing around each one. The third, however, was different. He had killed that one with Anaklusmos. And if Mrs. Dodds had come back so quickly, who was to say that one wouldn't as well? "Oh yes, of course," said the woman quickly, her tone kind. "We can't let you stay like that. Still, it's dangerous to be out this late. Perhaps it would be better if you looked for your group tomorrow." "No," said Percy, shaking his head. "They'd leave us behind without hesitation if we wait. Just a little food and some light will be enough." All right, come in, I'll help you," said the woman, stepping aside to let them enter. Percy frowned again. There was something unsettling about how eager she was to get them inside. He wasn't the only one who felt it, Annabeth noticed it too. Even so, the three of them stepped through the doorway, planning to leave as soon as possible. The smell of food grew stronger, almost intoxicating. But Percy and Annabeth, their stomachs still full from the meat they'd eaten earlier, weren't tempted. That meat had left them completely satiated and brimming with energy. Grover, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. With an empty stomach and nerves still on edge from the garden full of statues, he swallowed hard as he looked at the plates of food laid out on the table. "Go ahead, you can eat all you want. No need for money, it's my treat," said the woman kindly as she closed the door and locked it. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen to continue cooking. When Percy saw the door being locked, his unease sharpened into full alert. Maybe he wasn't as paranoid as he thought. That instinct he was learning to trust, a mix of survival sense and divine warning, wasn't something to ignore. Grover, oblivious to the danger, approached the table, grabbed some fries, and began eating happily. Percy looked at Annabeth. She met his gaze with the same tense expression, sharing the same thought: something here isn't right. "Go on, you two as well, eat, the woman insisted sweetly, inviting them with a smile invisible beneath her veil. They glanced at each other, then approached the table, pretending to take food and place it on their plates. Percy picked up a hamburger, lifted the bun slightly, and sniffed. The smell was like any triple cheeseburger: greasy meat, lightly melted cheese, slices of pickles, but there was another scent, something strange he couldn't quite identify, though it felt disturbingly familiar. Flashback. Percy lay on the ground, exhausted after hauling a chest full of gold. Sweat ran down his face, and his clothes were covered in dirt. A few feet away, Marac watched him indifferently before returning to his task, cooking something in a massive pot, one that Percy suspected had been borrowed from the camp's dining hall when no one was looking. Then again, if Marac didn't want to be seen, no one would see him, even if he were standing right in front of them. "What are you cooking, master?" Percy asked with mild curiosity, taking the chance to lie back and let his eyelids droop. He could have fallen asleep right there, his whole body aching. "Poison," replied Marac with complete calm. Percy's eyes shot open, and he jumped up, powered purely by fear and will. "You're not planning to poison me if I fail training, right?" he said, hiding behind a nearby tree. Marac looked at him as if he were an idiot. He seemed about to say no, but then stopped, as if considering it. "Now that you mention it, that might not be a bad idea. It could improve your resistance to toxins," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it seems your brain actually works." "What?" Percy managed to say, realizing he had just caused his own doom. "I'll add a little to your food from now on. Don't worry, it won't kill you. Though you might want to build a bathroom nearby," Marac added calmly as he tossed more ingredients into the pot: strangely colored plants, the head of a snake, and what looked like a glowing toad. End of the memory. Percy returned to the present and looked at the hamburger suspiciously. Then he glanced at Annabeth and quickly shook his head, silently warning her not to take a single bite. Then he turned to Grover, and froze. The satyr had even stuffed the wax paper into his mouth, chewing enthusiastically. The woman came back with more dishes, setting them down on the table before fixing her gaze on Annabeth. "What's wrong, Annabeth? Don't you like my cooking?" she asked sweetly, though something in her voice sounded off. "Ah, no, I ate a lot earlier. My stomach's full," replied Annabeth, nervous. Percy immediately noticed the most disturbing detail: they had never introduced themselves. How did she know Annabeth's name? He didn't let his expression reveal anything. "Oh, I see. What a pity. I spent so much time cooking, it would be such a waste to throw it all away," said the woman, appealing to Annabeth's manners, as if trying to pressure her into eating. "Ah, I'm sorry. We could pay you for the food. Maybe we could take it to our friends from the circus, if you don't mind," said Annabeth, trying to buy time and already thinking of dumping it as soon as they left. The woman stood in front of her, staring silently. Annabeth swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold eye contact. "I see. I suppose there's nothing to be done," the woman said at last, calm again. Then she changed the subject smoothly. "Still, your gray eyes are truly beautiful." "Thank you," Annabeth replied, confused. "I'll prepare a bag for you to take the food with you," said the woman before turning and disappearing toward the back of the shop. As soon as she was gone, Percy stood up and gave Grover a light smack on the head. What's wrong, Percy?" mumbled Grover, half asleep. "Phew, it's not poison. Looks like it's a sleeping agent," Percy muttered, noticing his friend's glazed expression. Still, his face showed growing concern. "We have to go," said Annabeth urgently. They walked toward the door, but it was locked, and, of course, the key was nowhere to be found. The windows, too, were covered with iron bars from the outside. Only then did they realize they were trapped. Percy noticed a half-open door at the back. It seemed to lead to the basement. "Follow me," he ordered seriously, while he and Annabeth supported Grover, who was barely staying conscious. Annabeth gave him a light slap on the back to keep him awake. They descended the stairs, and what they found below left them frozen. Hundreds of stone statues filled the room. Some bore expressions of terror, others were broken, and many more depicted petrified Greek monsters and animals. "This," murmured Annabeth, her eyes widening in a mix of fear and realization. "Medusa." Percy looked at her seriously just as Grover, upon hearing the name, snapped fully awake, the sleeping effect completely gone. Medusa," he stammered, trembling. He immediately remembered the statue in the garden, the one that looked so much like his Uncle Ferdinand. Before they could say anything, they heard footsteps and the creak of the basement door opening. "Hide behind the crates," whispered Percy. They ran quickly and ducked out of sight. From his hiding spot, Percy could see several boxes marked with shipping labels. One of them, right in front of him, read, "To DOA Recording Studios. Location: West Hollywood, Los Angeles, California." It seemed Medusa shipped her statues all across the country, and had plenty of clients. "Where are my children? I packed your food for you," came the woman's soft voice. Then a faint hissing sound filled the air, multiplying. "Snakes. Dozens of them." A shadow stretched across the wall as the figure stepped in front of the light. Her hair moved on its own, alive and writhing. The woman walked slowly, heading straight toward where Grover was hiding. The Garden of Stone Shadows, Part 3. "You know, I once possessed great beauty, even if that sounds a bit narcissistic. Beautiful, radiant, young. Thanks to that, my lover fell deeply in love with me. A love that could transcend social boundaries. I was in love, oh, so deeply in love. My sisters, trying to help me meet my beloved, ended up suffering terribly. But it wasn't my fault, it was her. She took everything from me, my beauty, my sister's beauty. And why? Out of jealousy. Yes, jealousy. She punished me and my sisters with something vile," said the woman as she advanced slowly. For a moment, as if her anger increased by several levels, her voice grew more guttural. The sound of something breaking echoed through the air. The woman's shadow began to rise slightly, forming what seemed to be a large serpent's tail, the dragging sound scraping against the floor as it lifted higher, trying to see where they were hiding. Percy gestured to Grover not to make a sound. The satyr was crouched just one box away, hands covering his mouth. Meanwhile, Annabeth put on her cap, disappearing from Percy's sight. However, at one point she seemed to bump into a statue, causing a faint noise. "Your father and Athena have always been enemies. She punished me because your father loved me. That's how the gods are, Percy, beings who despise everyone except themselves. To them, we mortals are nothing but simple insects they can do whatever they want with. Don't let them use you, Percy Jackson, they're only using you, and then they'll discard you like all the others," she said before lunging over a crate, her massive serpentine tail coiling around it. When she opened her eyes to see what was hidden there were only a couple of animal statues. She changed direction, squeezing with her tail and crushing them along with the huge crate. Percy shifted his gaze. He moved slowly to the other side of the box to hide, his expression tense, the black sword in his hand. He was frustrated because he couldn't come out and attack Medusa, knowing that just one look from her would turn him to stone. "Come on, Percy, come out, we're not enemies. I even think we could be quite familiar, after all, you're his son. My hatred is only toward that gray-eyed woman who did this to me. I'm just a poor old lady," she said softly, almost purring. Annabeth's mother, that cursed Athena, turned a beauty into this, all out of jealousy, she added with a slight anger in her voice. "Don't listen to her, Percy," shouted Annabeth from who knows where, which only enraged Medusa. From his hiding place, Percy saw a large green serpent's tail whip toward one of the biggest crates. The box exploded from the sheer force of the impact, followed by the furious scream of the woman. "Silence," screamed Medusa, full of rage, before calming herself and lowering her voice again. "You see why I must destroy that girl, Percy," she added, as if trying to justify her fury. "Don't be a pawn of the Olympians, dear. Do you think that woman's father will thank you? Do you think they'll reward you? Don't suffer anymore. Just come out, turn into a statue, and you'll never have to feel pain again," she said, her tone carrying a hypnotic edge. She seemed to be just on the other side of the box, approaching slowly. Percy had his sword ready, gripping it tightly, uncertain. His reflexes weren't sharp enough to fight against a tail capable of destroying a huge box with one strike, and he couldn't risk looking directly at her without turning to stone. Then, a shout caught everyone's attention. "Perky!" Grover yelled. Percy saw him hovering with his winged shoes, holding what looked like garden gnomes in his arms. He flew toward Medusa with his eyes closed and threw the gnomes at random. One nearly hit Percy, who rolled on the ground to dodge it. Medusa raised her long tail to shield herself from the incoming projectile. In doing so, for a moment, she covered her own face, as if it were the most important thing to protect. That also allowed Grover to take advantage. He grabbed another nearby statue, that of a winged monster, and had to use all his strength to lift it. He flew again just in time before Medusa's tail struck, the statues behind Grover shattering under the blow meant for him. Percy looked at Grover, who was flying with a statue almost as big as himself, and his eyes widened before he ran to get out of the way. After all, Grover couldn't see where he was throwing things with his eyes closed, relying only on smells and sounds. The statue landed near Medusa but didn't hit her. When it hit the ground, it shattered into pieces, and fragments of stone flew in every direction. One of them grazed the Gorgon's cheek, and she screamed in fury. "Ah, miserable satyr, my face!" She screamed furiously, thrashing her tail in every direction, trying to destroy Grover just for barely scratching her cheek. "I'll turn you to stone and then grind you into dust so fine that you won't even deserve to be part of my collection," she roared, completely deranged. "That's for my Uncle Ferdinand," said Grover, not really knowing how much damage he had caused to Medusa, but hearing her furious screams, he figured it might have been enough. Meanwhile, Percy was thinking about how to attack her. Maybe he could take advantage of the moment when she was focused on Grover to strike from behind. At that instant, he felt a slight tug on his shirt. He turned around with his black sword raised, just in time to stop the blade at Annabeth's neck, who opened her eyes wide in surprise. "Don't do that," said Percy, placing a hand on his chest. He had been startled too. "You're one to talk. You almost stabbed me," Annabeth shot back, annoyed, rubbing her neck. Then she quickly shook her head and spoke urgently. "You have to cut off her head, like in the original story." "I'd love to, but if she so much as turns and looks at me, I'll end up as a garden gnome," Percy said, frowning. He was confident that with his sword, it would be easy to cut off her head. After all, he had already taken down 3 Furies before. An overgrown snake wasn't that big of a deal. Well, it was, but not for him. "Even if you lent me your cap again, it would only make me invisible. Even if she couldn't see me, her eyes would still turn me to stone the moment she looked my way," he added. "Yes, I know, I thought of that too, but, you're better armed, you have the best chance. You just need," Annabeth began scanning the surroundings quickly. Then her eyes widened as she noticed something. "I found your chance. You can get close. She'd grab me instantly because of my mother," she said as she picked up something nearby, a polished green crystal sphere. Percy looked at her, confused, while Annabeth studied it carefully, turning it in her hands as if she were calculating something. Ah, the convexity will cause distortion, the reflection size will change in proportion. Before she could continue, she noticed Percy staring at her blankly, as if thinking, "What the hell are you talking about?" while looking at her like she was an idiot. Annabeth's mind filled with irritation at his expression. He was the idiot who didn't understand anything, yet somehow she felt like the idiot for trying to explain something to that idiot. "Here, look at Medusa through the crystal." "Never directly," she said, her tone annoyed. At that moment, a loud crash interrupted them. The sound was so intense that both turned immediately. A massive statue of what looked like a cyclops had fallen right on the spot where Medusa was, causing the nearby statues to topple one after another. A roar of stone filled the air, and dust rose into a thick cloud that enveloped everything. "Guys, I think I did it. I think I knocked her out," Grover shouted triumphantly. "Yeah," roared Medusa from beneath the rubble, full of fury. Maybe not," muttered Grover, lowering his tone. Still, something was clear. The frenzied attack of her serpentine tail had stopped. Growls could be heard, as if the woman were straining, trying to break free. "She might be trapped," said Annabeth quickly. "Hurry, Percy, before she gets loose," she added seriously. Percy's eyes gleamed at the opportunity. Dust floated through the air, covering everything in a pale mist. He advanced with the crystal sphere in one hand, holding it in front of his face. The air was thick with dust, and the sound of Medusa dragging something heavy grew closer. When Percy reached the center of the dust cloud, he saw her. Medusa had part of her tail trapped beneath the Cyclops statue and was pulling with brutal force, trying to free herself. The stones groaned, and the serpents on her head hissed in frustration. But it wasn't just that statue. Like a domino effect, several petrified figures had fallen over her, or rather, over her tail, pinning her down. It was almost poetic. The very statues she had created now held her in place, as if seeking revenge. Even so, the tip of her tail was free, moving clumsily as she tried to push the stones away. It wasn't a hand, but a tail, and that made her movements awkward and slow. At that moment, seeing Percy approach with the sword in one hand and the sphere in the other, Medusa noticed him. Her eyes shone through the dust, fixed on him, and a chilling hiss filled the air. The Garden of Stone Shadows, final part. She opened her eyes. Through the sphere, Percy could see her hair expanding and hissing as it sensed his presence. Her face, distorted by the curvature of the reflection, looked even more horrific than it probably was in reality. Her scaly skin extended down her arms, covered in uneven pustules. A forked tongue slid between her lips as she growled with fury, and below her waist coiled an enormous tail, thick, powerful, and gleaming like that of a massive python. "You wouldn't hurt a poor old lady, would you, Percy?" the woman said in a tone so soft it almost sounded friendly. Percy raised an eyebrow without lowering the sphere from in front of his face. "Funny," he said calmly, strengthening his stance. In an instant, he pushed forward toward Medusa, still trapped, raising his sword high, ready to strike at her neck. "Because you seem to be mistaken about me, and with you, that'll make 4, he added coldly before swinging the blade. Medusa's eyes widened just in time to see the boy's sword coming down. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Her tail lifted slightly, trying to react, while her body arched backward. She knew that sword would sever her head and that there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her eyes filled with a cold, vengeful resolve, as if accepting that if she was going to die, she wouldn't die alone. The tip of her tail shot straight toward Percy's heart. The boy's sword sliced cleanly through the air, severing her head. However, her tail continued its swing, striking with brutal force. Percy was thrown several meters back, flipping once before landing on his feet, though he dropped to one knee upon impact. He released the sword and grabbed his opposite shoulder, where the blow had landed. He had managed to move at the very last second, narrowly avoiding being impaled. He could have stopped, but he knew a single hesitation might have given Medusa enough time to break free, and he would have lost the perfect moment to strike. As a precaution, Percy had closed his eyes when he fell. It turned out to be the right move, because he felt something rolling toward him. He instantly knew what it was. Medusa hadn't just relied on her tail, she'd prepared one final attack. If the strike failed, she'd counted on her own head turning him to stone. The crystal sphere had flown from his hand when he was hit, shattering into pieces upon striking the floor. Stay still, Percy, I'll handle it, said Annabeth as she hurried closer. Percy heard her quick footsteps, followed by the sound of something dropping over the head, a thick cloth. The serpents on Medusa's head were still alive, snapping their fangs and trying to bite at Percy's feet. Done, said Annabeth with a sigh of relief. Percy slowly opened his eyes. The head was covered by a small wooden box. A few snakes tried to slither out from underneath, but Annabeth had placed a heavy rock on top, keeping it from moving. In her other hand, she held another polished sphere, which she carefully set down on the ground. You did it, she said, exhaling deeply before her gaze drifted to Percy's shoulder, now drenched in blood and visibly dislocated. Percy followed her eyes and glanced at his shoulder. Oh, right, gotta fix that, he muttered calmly, as if it were nothing serious, though the tension in his face betrayed the pain. He walked toward a nearby crate, took a deep breath, and slammed his shoulder against it. A dry, cracking sound echoed in the air. The bones snapped back into place. Percy moved his arm carefully, making sure everything was working properly. Annabeth's eyes widened at the crude way he had reset his shoulder. She quickly reached into her bag. Eat this, it'll heal you, she said, offering him a small cube and a vial filled with golden liquid. Oh, right, that stuff, Percy replied before swallowing it without hesitation. He glanced at his shoulder, watching as the wound slowly began to close. Not bad, he said, flexing his arm lightly. Almost as good as my master's cooking, though a bit slower than his healing spells. Annabeth stared at him as if she were looking at a monster. How can you just endure pain like that? Even with nectar and ambrosia, the pain should last for a while, she said, knowing that kind of wound wasn't easy to heal. Back at camp, something like that would take days to recover from, even with healers. Grover approached, exhausted and panting. He had seen Percy's shoulder and nearly fainted, but managed to keep it together, until Percy slammed his bloody arm against the crate to fix it. Then he threw up. That injury, please, Percy said as if discussing something mundane. During training, I'd sometimes break bones or get wounds so deep all you could see was blood. There's actually a funny story about that, he added casually, sensing the heavy mood and trying to lighten it a bit. Flashback. What are you doing? Asked Marac, staring at his student, who was holding a dagger and trying to cut what looked like his weighted training pack. I feel like the wheat's gotten too light after a week, so I thought I could make it bigger, or maybe carry the chest directly. But I need some fabric to wrap it with so it doesn't slip, and I figured the straps of my pack would do, Percy said seriously, as if he'd just had a brilliant idea. Then he lowered the dagger and sliced downward, glancing at his master expectantly, waiting for praise. But he felt something. He looked down and raised his hand. There were only 4 fingers. The 5th lay on the ground, covered in blood. Ah! Percy screamed as a golden light surrounded him. His finger, which had been lying on the floor, slowly rose, suspended by his master's magic, until it reattached itself. Percy kept screaming as he watched the finger reconnect, the flesh seal itself, and the wound close completely. His screams gradually faded until they stopped entirely. Silence filled the room. Marac stared at him with an expression somewhere between boredom and disappointment, shaking his head slowly, as if wondering at what point his apprentice had decided to have less brain than a troll. End of flashback. Percy looked at his companions, expecting them to at least laugh at the story. But they only stared back at him in silence, with a mix of disbelief and resignation. For a brief moment, they wondered if the ruthless monster who had just fought so fiercely could really be the same 12-year-old boy standing before them. We should get out of here, this place gives me the creeps, said Grover, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to change the subject. He glanced nervously at the box that held the head. Don't unwrap it, it can still petrify, Annabeth warned seriously. They both ignored Percy completely, who scratched his head awkwardly, smiling faintly as he looked at his friends. Despite everything, he felt that during this journey, they had grown a little closer. Maybe he hadn't bonded much with the other kids back at camp, but he had a good excuse. His master always kept him training. Most of his free time was spent in the forest, alone, practicing in silence until dusk. And by the time he realized it, it was already too late to socialize. Maybe, when he got back, he could try talking to the others. After all, technically they were all family, right? Even Percy, now that he thought about it, figured that made him some kind of distant uncle to a few of them. If Athena was Poseidon's niece, then logically, Annabeth would be something like his niece-in-law. Well, that didn't really matter. So, what do we do with this? Should we thank Athena for this monster? Percy asked with a serious look. Annabeth gave him a glare before replying sharply. Your father, you mean? Don't you remember? Medusa was Poseidon's girlfriend, and they desecrated my mother's temple together, she said defensively, crossing her arms. She and her two sisters helped her enter the temple, and that's why they were punished and turned into the three Gorgons. That's why she wanted to turn me into stone paste. But you, she wanted to keep you as a pretty statue. You probably reminded her of your father when he was young. Great, Percy muttered sarcastically. If we're following the gods, love stories, how many toxic ex-girlfriends of the gods are we going to have to kill in the future? And that's not even counting the ex-boyfriends. Wait, weren't there also some animals? He added, his face twisting with equal parts annoyance and disgust. Could you stop insulting the gods for 1 minute before you get struck by lightning? Snapped Annabeth, exasperated. Right on cue, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, even though they were still in the basement. Percy gave her a look of irritation, listening to her defend the very gods who seemed to want them dead rather than alive. Honestly, sometimes you're impossible. And you're insufferable, Annabeth shot back without missing a beat. And you're a, Percy began, but Grover interrupted. Enough, you two are giving me a headache, and satyrs don't get headaches. He shouted, covering his ears. Now, what are we going to do with the head? He asked quickly, desperate to change the subject. Percy glanced at the box. It had blank spaces for the sender, recipient, and shipping information. His mind swirled with chaotic thoughts. His first real battle, nearly getting struck by lightning, and now this. All on the first day of their quest. He walked over to a nearby office, where piles of shipping papers were scattered everywhere. He noticed the name of the delivery company and opened the cash register. Inside were a few coins, but mostly drachmas. He grabbed a sheet of paper and began to write with steady handwriting. Mount Olympus, 600th floor, Empire State Building. For all the gods, with my best wishes, Perseus Jackson. He placed a few drachmas into a small pouch, set it atop the box, and slid the lid shut from beneath without lifting it. A faint golden light surrounded the package. It floated a few inches above the ground before disappearing completely. That is not going to go over well, said Grover with a note of panic. Even Annabeth couldn't help but look at the scene with a mix of awe and horror. Percy, meanwhile, was flipping through the papers on the table. One of them had an address addressed to Persephone in the underworld. Without hesitation, he tore it off and tucked it into his pocket. And what are they going to do? Punish me, he said with a mocking smile. Even before leaving for this mission, I already got a lightning bolt as a gift from my uncle. Maybe he considers that a present, but I don't see it that way. Without waiting for a reply, Percy started up the basement stairs. Grover and Annabeth exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or follow him, and finally went after him in silence. Threads in the dark, a vast black hole stretched before Percy, devouring every trace of light as if trying to consume life itself. The boy stood motionless, his face frozen in utter confusion, a faint tremor of fear flickering in his eyes. He seemed to be inside a massive, silent cavern, swallowed by a darkness so thick that even the echo of his own breath refused to return. The abyss pulsed faintly, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. Around him, gray mist creatures drifted slowly, their distorted shapes barely visible within the shadows. They surrounded him, shifting and gesturing frantically, as if trying to warn him of something. Percy, however, paid them no mind. His eyes were locked on the black void, drawn to it by a force he couldn't resist. And it was calling him. From the depths came a voice, dark, low, and resonant, so deep it seemed to vibrate inside his chest. It was chilling, almost tangible, and at the same time filled with a power that demanded to be heard. Some of the specters, the spirits born from that gray mist, clutched at Percy's clothes in desperation, trying to pull him away from the edge. But he, entranced, continued forward, step by step, until he stood right at the rim of the abyss. Something was moving down there, something ancient that sought to rise from the bowels of the void. And then, suddenly, Percy felt it, a gaze, invisible yet suffocating, fixing upon him from the depths below. A shiver raced down his spine. The air thickened, heavy and alive, and then a wicked laugh rolled out from the darkness, echoing off the stone walls. "Hey, the little hero," whispered the voice, its tone dripping with amusement. The echo repeated endlessly, rumbling through the cavern like thunder. "Too weak. Too young, but perhaps you could still be of use to me, the voice said again, cold and deep, wrapping around Percy's mind like a serpent slithering through his thoughts. They've lied to you, boy, it continued, now softer, hypnotic. Make a deal with me. I can give you what you want most. At those words, an image began to form above the abyss. Percy's eyes widened in shock. It was Sally Jackson. She was encased within a crystal of ice, sleeping peacefully at first, until her eyes suddenly opened. She looked straight at him, saying nothing, but the plea in her gaze was unmistakable. She was begging for help. Mom, Percy tried to shout, but no sound came out. His throat was sealed by the darkness, though his mouth moved desperately. He screamed with all his strength, so much that he thought his voice would tear his throat apart. Muahahaha, the voice laughed again, filled with cruel delight. The entire abyss trembled as an invisible force pushed Percy forward, dragging him slowly toward the edge. Help me escape, boy. The voice roared. Bring me the lightning bolt, steal it from those traitors. Wake up. The words slipped into his mind, different, foreign. Come now, boy, make the deal, urged the shadowed voice. Wake up, now, repeated the other voice, closer this time, real. Do it, those cursed gods will pay. The abyssal voice hissed, its tone turning frantic. I said wake up, brat. The impact came like thunder. A sharp pain burst across Percy's head, forcing him upright as he clutched his skull with a groan. Ouch, he muttered, rubbing his forehead, feeling a lump already forming beneath his fingers. He blinked rapidly, scanning the area in confusion, searching for whoever had hit him. He was lying on a makeshift bed of fabric and dried grass. Nearby, a small campfire crackled softly, warming the damp night air and drying the clothes they'd hung to the side. They had taken what they needed from Medusa's house, which stood only a few meters away, but none of the three had wanted to spend the night inside. So they'd set up camp just beyond it, in a small clearing under the trees. Annabeth slept peacefully a few feet away, while Grover, who was supposed to take the first watch, was fast asleep on a tree branch, hugging his reed pipes lovingly as a thin line of drool hung from his mouth. Percy's reflexes kicked in. He unsheathed his sword in one swift motion. He could feel someone behind him, the likely culprit of the blow. He swung backward sharply, but a hand caught the blade with effortless precision. And then Percy saw him. His master, Marac, stood there, towering and silent, his expression so stern that even the fire seemed to dim under his gaze. Didn't I tell you not to make deals with whatever thing shows up in front of you? He said flatly, his voice firm, a mix of irritation and restrained anger. Yet something in his eyes told Percy that the fury wasn't truly directed at him. What? Percy asked, confused, though a flicker of relief crossed his face at the sight of his teacher. That relief vanished the instant he noticed Marac's serious expression. I already told you how I ended up in Apocrypha, Marac said darkly. You'd better not even think about trying it, unless you want to end up surrounded by ancient books and rotting tentacles. Percy kept rubbing his head, still aching. My two favorite things, he muttered sarcastically. Another hit came, right on the same spot. Ouch, master, you're the one who says I seem a little stupid. If you keep hitting me, don't you think that might become true? Marac regarded him silently for a moment, then replied calmly. You're right, maybe that hit actually fixed your brain. Percy sighed, feeling that those words hurt even more than the blow. Well, almost. The blow still hurt like hell. Take this, said Marac, tossing him a small vial filled with a golden liquid that shimmered softly in the darkness. What's this? Asked Percy, examining the bottle curiously. As soon as he held it, he felt a faint energy coursing through his hand, as if the liquid itself were alive. On the label stuck to the side, he managed to read something that looked like Soma, or maybe it said Toma. He wasn't sure. It's so you'll stop being so stupid. You can drink half, Marac replied without further explanation. Is this some kind of brain booster? Master, you really shouldn't trust those crooks who sell fake tonics. You'll just end up with a stomachache. Trust me, I tried one once to get rid of my dyslexia, said Percy, eyeing the bottle with deep suspicion. Marac stared at him for a few seconds, then said calmly. Better drink it all. The look on his master's face was enough to convince him. Percy understood that if he kept talking, he'd probably get hit again, so he just nodded and gulped the liquid down in one go. The bottle was left completely empty, not a single drop remaining. Percy waited for a moment, trying to taste or feel something, but it was like drinking pure, transparent, golden water. Other than that, he didn't feel anything special. I told you, Master, you shouldn't trust. Percy didn't get to finish his sentence. A strange heat began to rise from his stomach, spreading rapidly through his entire body. He opened his eyes wide, lifting his hands as they began to glow softly. Then he felt the light shifting, flowing upward, gathering in his head, until, suddenly, it was as if a veil had been torn away from his mind. He felt it, a clarity unlike anything he had ever experienced flooded through him. Every thought became sharp, every idea bright and perfectly aligned. His senses sharpened, his vision especially. The ash rising from the campfire drifted before him like tiny silver flakes, and even the insects crawling along the nearby trees seemed clear, vivid, almost luminous. But that wasn't the strangest part. When he turned his gaze toward Marac, he noticed something he had never seen before. His master stood upright as always, posture perfect and commanding, yet there was something off. A minute detail, imperceptible to anyone else but him. Marac's balance seemed to shift subtly from one leg to the other, a barely visible sway, as if he were wobbling. Percy blinked. Was that even possible? Master, are you drunk? He blurted out before he could stop himself. Naturally, that was the first thing that came to his mind. After all, Percy knew someone who wobbled exactly like that, Gabe Ugliano. And besides, he had seen Marac drink an absurd amount of alcohol without ever being affected. For him, wine or mead was the same as water. Marac watched him for a moment, then, for the first time, seemed slightly amused. Yes, he replied calmly. It seems I drank something unusual. For a while, I'll have this curious effect that grows stronger over time. Although, to be honest, it's not unpleasant. I haven't felt like this in thousands of years, so I'll enjoy it for a bit before purging it from my body. A faint smile curved his lips. Percy looked at him, baffled, then just shrugged. If his master said it was fine, then it probably was, though that smile was definitely the most unsettling version of fine he had ever seen. Still, something else caught his attention. When he glanced toward Annabeth, who slept a few feet away, he saw a faint golden thread rising from above her head, barely visible. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. Then he looked at Grover and saw the same thing, another thread, thin and shimmering, stretching upward into the night. But when he blinked again, both vanished as if they had never been there. Good, Marac said suddenly. It seems your magicka has increased as well. Magicka, you mean mana, right? You said I couldn't use magic because I didn't have enough, Percy replied, recalling his training, and the time he tried to avoid sword practice by declaring he wanted to be a wizard. Marac had shut him down immediately, with a lecture about discipline that lasted half an hour. So, can I use magic now? He asked, his tone bright with curiosity. Marac didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his cloak and pulled out 2 old books, their covers made of hardened leather and marked with strange hues. Each bore a rune engraved in its center, faintly pulsing with a life of its own. He tossed them to Percy, who caught them awkwardly. Study these for now, they'll serve you in your childish adventure. Childish, you do realize we were attacked by furies from the underworld and a cursed Medusa, right? Percy protested indignantly. Yes, said Marac calmly. That's exactly why I said it. He then extended one hand toward Percy without saying another word. Percy blinked, confused, and, thinking his master wanted help standing up, offered him his hand. Marac gripped it firmly, meeting his gaze for a long, silent moment. Seems that potion wasn't entirely effective, he muttered in a thoughtful tone. I'll have to find more. He sighed lightly, then continued. Give me the black soul gems. I'll forge armor and enchant it for you. Soul gems, Percy repeated, frowning as he tried to remember. He rummaged through his bag and pulled out 3 dark crystals with faint violet gleams. You mean these? Yes, though that was only a test, Marac said, taking them carefully. He studied them under the firelight, as if he could see something hidden within. I wonder if these can connect to the soul recaller, he murmured under his breath before tucking them away. Can I pick the design of my armor? Asked Percy eagerly, a spark of excitement lighting up his eyes. Marac glanced back at him. No, and with that, he turned and vanished into the shadows of the forest. Stingy master, Percy muttered, though a smile crept onto his face. Still, the idea of having armor crafted by Marac was more than enough to make him feel thrilled. He sighed, staring at the fire for a while before walking over to Annabeth to wake her for the next watch. He planned to get some more sleep, at least until his realigned brain stopped throbbing. The train of Magica. The train of Magica. Can you imagine how much of a pain it would be not to travel first class? I mean, come on, people would totally lose it, said Percy as he stretched and pointed at Grover's legs, who had just taken off his fake feet. How rude, grumbled Grover with a frown. But, to be fair, he knew Percy was right. Traveling like this was uncomfortable. They had to stay alert in case someone looked at them or overheard things they shouldn't. And to make matters worse, if any of them fell asleep, the others had to keep one eye open to make sure Grover didn't lose his prosthetic feet. They owed this long trip to Percy, or rather, to Percy's money. That morning, however, they'd had a rather pleasant conversation, if one could call it that, with a small poodle that had befriended Grover. The dog had even offered to help them get some money for their trip as repayment for rescuing him. Apparently, he had run away from a family he despised. Fortunately for the poodle, he didn't have to. Percy and the others had enough to cover the costs, and the little dog got to enjoy his freedom a bit longer before someone, inevitably, found him and sent him back home. Still, something caught Annabeth's and Grover's attention when they woke up: Percy's eyes. They had always been that deep sea green color, but now they seemed to glow slightly, as if lit from within. For a moment, it almost made him look smarter. Well, until he opened his mouth. Once they boarded the train, they found a private compartment just for themselves. They also bought some food for Grover and a bit of fruit for the two of them. According to Annabeth, it wasn't healthy to live solely on dried meat. Although, to be honest, it seemed more like she didn't want to get used to its taste. After all, if she did, regular food would forever feel like garbage in comparison. Thinking about it, I guess that made sense. Well, for her. The compartment door was locked, so they could relax as they traveled. Still, their destination was far away. Even by train, it would take nearly 2 days to reach, and barely half a day had passed. Percy sat quietly, a goofy smile on his face and a strange book in his hands. Annabeth watched him curiously before finally asking, "What are you reading? Don't tell me you found something forbidden, right?" she said, her tone carrying a hint of disgust. "What? No," Percy replied immediately, realizing what she meant. "It's a magic book," he added defensively. Annabeth raised an eyebrow. "Magic?" she asked, clearly skeptical. "Hee, but that's not the important part," Percy said with a slightly smug grin. "Maybe I finally beat my dyslexia and can read perfectly now." He lifted the yellow book and pointed at the first page, where the title read clearly, Healing. Beginner. Annabeth looked at him for a few seconds, then glanced down at the book. "I can read it too," she said at last, a touch of surprise in her voice. Normally, reading gave her some trouble, but this time the words stayed still, perfectly clear, not jumping around like they usually did. Percy looked at the text again, frowning before muttering. "Tisk, I thought that potion had reprogrammed my brain, but it looks like the book itself is special." He said it with a trace of annoyance, though the satisfaction in his expression was obvious. "Where did you get that book?" Annabeth asked quickly. It was the first time she'd seen something like it. Not only could she understand the language, but she could read it fluently, as if she'd known it all her life. It was different from Greek letters or runes, which she grasped through intuition. This felt real. "My master gave it to me," Percy said, finally putting an end to his antics as he returned to reading. The books Marac had given him were about 10 in total. Half contained healing spells, and the other half were about protection, meant to harden the skin and reduce incoming damage. Percy understood the message. His master was worried about him. The thought made him smile, a mix between amusement and warmth. He knew that if Marac heard that thought, he'd probably get another smack on the head. Even so, Percy felt a comforting warmth in his chest. It was nice to know his teacher cared enough to keep him alive. "Your master?" Annabeth asked, her gaze falling on the yellow-covered book in Percy's hand. Its surface bore a large rune that shimmered faintly, almost as if it were breathing. "Yeah, this one seems to be a healing spell. It's pretty easy to understand," Percy said, lifting his hand and following the steps in the book. A soft golden light began to form on his palm, spreading gently through his body before fading away. "Oh, that feels nice," he murmured in awe, testing it for the first time. Grover, who had been watching from his seat, opened his eyes wide in shock and mild panic. "Oh, Mother Nature. That was natural magic, holy healing, ancient magic. I don't know what it was, but it had enormous natural power. He exclaimed, hurrying toward Percy. Percy glanced at him, slightly uncomfortable, and leaned back as the satyr's face came dangerously close to his. You're way too close, he said, pushing Grover's face away with his hand. You don't get it, that was different from manipulating the mist. It came from your body, Grover said seriously. Yeah, I know. The book says, channel your internal magicka and release it gently, Percy replied, pointing to a line in the text. Magicka, Annabeth repeated. It's probably something like mana, magical energy, spiritual power, something like that. I don't really know. My master just said that everyone has magicka, Percy explained, then lowered his voice, muttering to himself, well, at least in his world. After all, magic in Tamriel existed for a specific reason. This world, however, had a different source, the mist. From what he'd understood from his master, Percy might possess something similar to magicka thanks to his divine blood. Maybe that was why he could also use powers related to water. Annabeth watched him with a mix of interest and restraint. The topic fascinated her, but she knew that asking Percy to lend her one of his books could be complicated. Especially since they were gifts from his master. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. More than the magic itself, what truly intrigued her was the knowledge, the structure of that language they both seemed able to read. Percy, on the other hand, noticed her expression easily. It was as if his perception had sharpened enough to read people's emotions just by looking at them, at least those who weren't very good at hiding them, like Annabeth, or Grover, whose face was practically an open book. He could see a jumble of feelings swirling inside him, confusion, fear, rejection, acceptance, and finally, resignation. It was funny, really, considering Grover was the one who could usually sense other people's emotions. Well, my master didn't say anything about not showing it to others. And knowing him, he would have made it very clear if he didn't want anyone to see it. So I guess it's fine if you study the first book. Besides, it'll help if we ever run out of nectar or ambrosia, Percy said as he handed her the book in his hand. Annabeth's eyes widened. She hadn't expected that. Percy was rarely this thoughtful, especially with her, given how often they argued. Besides, I already finished it. I need to start the next one, he added calmly. Annabeth looked down at the book, then back at Percy. Her voice came out softer, almost shy. Thanks, she murmured, her cheeks faintly flushed at the gesture. Meanwhile, Percy felt Grover's gaze fixed on him and couldn't help but smile. He reached into his bag, rummaging through the books his master had given him. There were 10 in total, 4 about healing, 4 about defense, and 2 with red covers. Percy took the last 2 curiously and opened them. One read Calm, and the other, Fury, both belonging to the School of Illusion. He frowned. Those weren't really his kind of spells, and it was strange that Marac had given them to him. But when he looked up at Annabeth and Grover, he understood. Those books weren't meant for him. His master had given them thinking of his companions, not because he cared about them personally, but so they wouldn't become a burden to Percy during his mission. Percy smiled, happier than before, and handed both books to Grover. Here, learn them well, he said with a light grin. Grover's eyes widened with joy as he looked at the books, then at his friend, filled with genuine gratitude. Thanks, Percy, you're really a great friend, he said, his voice trembling, almost on the verge of tears. Ever since Percy had discovered his demigod heritage and joined Camp Halfblood, Grover had felt that their friendship from Yancey Academy had cracked a little. He'd even thought Percy had built a wall between them, but now he realized that maybe it had only been in his head. Of course, what Grover didn't know was that this wall had only fallen because Percy's master had included his companions in his plans. Percy had figured it out quickly, maybe thanks to that potion that had made him a little sharper. If Marac had considered either of them a threat or a potential traitor, as the prophecy warned, he never would have given them something so valuable. And just like that, without realizing it, Annabeth and Grover had lowered their guard around Percy, feeling closer, more trusting, all thanks to a couple of books. While his companions buried themselves in their reading, Percy turned his gaze toward the train window. The landscape rushed by, forest stretching endlessly on both sides. For a moment, he thought he saw a massive lion walking calmly among the trees, its golden mane glimmering softly beneath the sunlight filtering through the branches. The creature turned its head toward the train, observed it briefly, then continued its path in peace. Further ahead, as the woods gave way to open plains, Percy spotted a group of centaurs running in formation. One of them, younger than the rest, noticed him and raised his hand in greeting. Percy gave a faint smile in return, watching as the young centaur ran back to what looked like his parents. Then his expression changed. His face grew serious as he watched the scenery fade into the distance. He glanced sideways at Annabeth and Grover, both absorbed in their books. One less thing to worry about, he murmured quietly. Now I can focus on my mission. His voice was low, almost inaudible, but his eyes were sharp, steady. He opened another book, its first page titled Oakflesh, and began to read as the train sped along the rails. Outside, the sun dipped slowly below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange. The day was ending, and with it, the first step toward a journey far greater than any of them could imagine. Deals and destinies. Ha, great, said Percy in a tone that was almost mocking and sarcastic as he read the newspaper that the vendor passing through the train cars had left for Annabeth, who seemed intent on catching up on something. In the photo, Percy stood with a distant expression, caught by some tourist who must have thought it was worth photographing him. In his hands, he held his swords, though in the image they looked like nothing more than two blurred shapes, one black, the other bronze. They could easily be mistaken for baseball bats. However, the real question wasn't why he looked so spaced out in the photo, but why anyone would even use two baseball bats. Percy had to admit, though, that the pose looked pretty cool. What he didn't like was what was written above and below the picture, or rather, all around it. It read, Percy Jackson, 12 years old, wanted for questioning in relation to the disappearance of his parents, Sally Jackson and Gabe Ugliano, 2 weeks ago. He was last seen boarding a bus with several elderly women. The bus later exploded on a highway in New Jersey shortly after Jackson left the scene. According to statements, police believe he may be traveling with 2 teenage accomplices. Now everyone's going to think I enjoy beating up old ladies, Percy said with a strained smile. Annabeth and Grover exchanged a glance. Don't worry, the police are mortals, Annabeth said, trying to sound calm. They won't be able to find us, easily, she added, though her tone didn't sound entirely confident. Percy decided to focus on his magic book instead, his attention sharper than before as the train rushed along the rails. Annabeth, however, kept glancing at him from time to time, something Percy noticed easily. Finally, without lifting his eyes too far from the pages, he sighed. Just say it, he muttered, tired of her persistent looks. Fine, who's the one asking for your help? She asked directly. Percy set the book aside to look at her, confused. When you were asleep, you said someone wanted your help, Annabeth explained, watching him intently. Percy stared at her silently, debating whether or not to tell her. In the end, he decided it might be worth hearing a second opinion besides what his teacher had told him earlier. Annabeth listened to Percy's story, frowning and thinking for a while. It's unlikely that it's Hades, she finally said. He always appears on his throne, without a single smile, she added with mild disdain. He offered me my mother in exchange for the deal. Who else could it be? After all, he's the one who took her, Percy replied coldly. Well, you've got a point, but if what he wants is to start a war and escape the underworld, why would he ask you to bring the bolt if he's supposed to already have it? Annabeth asked, puzzled. Percy's expression grew complicated. Don't tell me you actually considered it, she said, looking surprised. No, Percy answered bitterly. My teacher said that if I didn't know who I was making a deal with, I could end up in a place full of books and rotting tentacles. Whatever that place is, he added with irritation. Annabeth looked at him in confusion. You already told him, when? She asked. It doesn't matter, Percy said, reopening his book. He wanted to learn as fast as possible, to be ready for whatever came next. If he had to fight, he wanted to be prepared. Annabeth sighed. You can't make a deal with Hades. He's a liar and greedy, she said, but Percy spoke up without lifting his eyes from the pages. Like all gods, right? He said, with a faint trace of mockery in his voice. Not all of them are like that, Annabeth replied quickly, defensive. Oh yeah, Percy finally looked up. Isn't Athena the one who has children with men she deems intelligent enough to bear them, then leaves the babies at their father's doors without even asking if they can raise them? Or wasn't it the same goddess who struck Arachne just because she wove better than her? When Arachne tried to end her life, Athena turned her into a spider so she'd weave forever. Or maybe, Wasn't it her rivalry with Hera and Aphrodite over who was the most beautiful that sparked one of the bloodiest wars in history? Percy's tone grew harsher with each word, his eyes glinting with a strange light. Annabeth looked at him in disbelief, not only because of the knowledge he had, but because those were stories few dared to even whisper, least of all children of Athena. Percy didn't stop. Hera and Heracles, Apollo sending plagues to those who didn't worship him, Artemis punishing Callisto because of Zeus, Aphrodite and the curse of Lemnos, Hermes turning mortals into birds just for fun, Dionysus driving kingdoms insane and into slaughter for rejecting his cult, Poseidon sinking fleets on a whim, Zeus deceiving women, Ares, who only craves war, destruction, and blue. He stopped suddenly, as if a revelation had struck him silent. It's not completely like that, Annabeth said, standing up with anger. But she couldn't continue. She found no words to defend them, especially not her mother. Everything Percy had said was true, though they were truths rarely spoken aloud. Percy looked at her quietly, then turned his gaze back toward the window. I don't get why you insist on defending them. None of them are good people, or whatever they are. Like Medusa said, to them we're just toys they can control, he muttered coldly. My mother isn't like that. She protects me when I need her. She let me reach the camp when not even my father cared enough to worry about me, said Annabeth, her voice trembling with contained fury. Percy looked at her, his expression a little calmer this time. My father, he didn't love me, she continued tensely. He didn't want children. Even when I was born, he asked Athena to take me away because he was too busy with his work. He spoke about my arrival as if it were the most annoying thing that had ever happened to him. And when he married his new wife, he didn't even want me near their kids. They pretended I didn't exist. They despised me, hated me. Her voice began to crack, growing softer and heavy with sadness. So I ran away. I left home with no one but Athena watching over me. As she spoke, Annabeth squeezed tightly the small college ring hanging from her necklace, as if that little piece of metal was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her words seemed to strike something deep within Percy. He sighed quietly, feeling a pang of guilt. He looked at her, unsure how to comfort her, scratching his head awkwardly. Maybe he had gone too far. But it truly frustrated him to see her defend the gods when they were the main reason behind so many problems, those of the present, the future, and probably many more yet to come. Not to mention the fact that Zeus seemed ready to strike him down with a lightning bolt every time he remembered Percy existed. Percy lowered his voice, speaking more softly. My mom married a horrible man who made my entire childhood a nightmare, and she still chose him to protect me, he said, his tone tinged with melancholy. Maybe your father did the same. Annabeth, completely defeated, her eyes brimming with tears, whispered, he doesn't love me. She looked down, her voice barely audible. His wife treated me like a monster. And when I got close to their children, they pushed me away. Every time something dangerous happened, or a monster showed up, they all looked at me with resentment, as if saying, how dare you put our family in danger. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. That's why it bothers me when you speak badly of Athena. When she said it, she lifted her gaze toward Percy, her eyes locking onto his. Percy, feeling that look, let out another sigh. There was no arguing with that. All right, it's my fault. Maybe I got carried away, he admitted. But to be fair, being a good mother doesn't necessarily make her a good person. Still, let's make a deal. He leaned forward slightly, his tone more relaxed. I'll try my hardest not to speak out against the gods, and in exchange, you'll try your hardest not to defend them to the death. Annabeth looked at him, slightly annoyed, but the intensity in her eyes slowly faded. Her expression softened, and for the first time during the conversation, she seemed lighter, almost relieved. Fine, she finally said. Percy nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips, as if that truce was enough, for now. A Not-So-Fun Trip, Part 1. 8 days before the summer solstice, and after 2 days of traveling by train, Percy and the others decided to change their route. They could have kept going by rail, but realistically, their luck at not being attacked for so long was almost miraculous. With each passing day, a strange uneasiness grew among them, a shared feeling, as if staying on the train was becoming increasingly dangerous, as if something was waiting for them. That sense of dread only deepened whenever they thought about continuing the journey. However, Percy noticed something peculiar. Every time Grover or Annabeth hesitated about moving forward, that same thread he had first seen after drinking his teacher's strange elixir faintly appeared above their heads. He tried repeating, again and again, that staying on the train was the fastest option, but whenever he did, those threads glimmered faintly and the others immediately rejected the idea, overcome by fear, nervousness, or simple discomfort. Percy was confused. He didn't fully understand what those threads were, but one thing was clear: they seemed to influence Grover's and Annabeth's thoughts, filling them with fear whenever they considered following his suggestion. The problem was that Percy couldn't tell whether those threads were helping them or warning them. At least, they still seemed to have free will. It was more like a sixth sense telling them that continuing would be dangerous. That gave him some comfort. At least they weren't being controlled. The strange part was that he didn't feel it himself. He didn't see any thread over his own head either. He even tried checking with a mirror, but nothing. For now, he decided to follow his companion's instincts and save the mystery of those threads for later. That was how they ended up getting off in St. Louis. As they stepped out of the station, Annabeth seemed slightly excited. She craned her neck to see the famous gateway arch, that great metallic curve rising into the sky. To Percy, it looked more like the giant handle of a shopping bag in the middle of the city, as if the whole place were part of some giant's market. And honestly, thinking of it that way was kind of cool. Annabeth, however, looked at it with admiration and fascination. "I want to make something like that," she said, eyes gleaming, almost dreamily. "The giant handle?" Percy asked with a smirk, pointing at the arch with his thumb. She rolled her eyes in exasperation. "Have you ever seen the Parthenon?" she asked, trying to ignore his nonsense. "Only in pictures," Percy replied. Annabeth smiled softly. "Someday I'll see it in person," she said with determination. "I'm going to build the greatest monument to the gods ever made. Something that lasts 1,000 years. Her voice was filled with conviction, but she immediately turned and pointed a finger at Percy, giving him a silent warning. After all, they had that deal they'd made back on the train. She wouldn't defend the gods to the death, and he would try not to criticize them so harshly. And, to be fair, Percy had been this close to saying something sarcastic. Seeing Annabeth's finger aimed at him with that challenging expression, Percy only smirked. "You're not making it easy," he said, suppressing the urge to let out a sharp comment. Still, a mischievous smile crossed his face as he shook his head, trying to keep his thoughts to himself. His expression, however, gave him away. The look on his face made it obvious what kind of jokes were running through his mind. Annabeth's face tightened slightly in annoyance. "Athena expects her children to create things. Not like a certain god of earthquakes," she said, her tone dripping with superiority. Percy said nothing. He just turned his gaze toward the water in the distance. Annabeth quickly noticed his silence. "Sorry, that was mean," she admitted with a sigh. "You're trying hard not to speak badly of the gods in front of me, and I did it anyway." Percy kept walking, not showing the slightest trace of anger. He waved his hand as if brushing it off. "It's fine. It's not like you said anything untrue. And the deal was that you wouldn't defend them to the death, and I wouldn't insult them. You insulting them, though, is kind of funny," he said with a grin. "Just don't expect me to defend them." Annabeth let out a small, tired laugh as she walked beside him. Soon after, the three reached the city center. Since there was still time before their next transport arrived, they decided to do a bit of sightseeing. At Annabeth's insistence, both Percy and Grover agreed. They visited the arch, explored an underground museum, and bought some supplies for their journey. Throughout the tour, Annabeth didn't stop talking about how the monument had been built, sharing architectural details that sounded straight out of a textbook. Percy, pretending to listen as he chewed on a gummy candy, suddenly froze. His expression changed. He closed his eyes for a moment, sharpening his senses. Then he slowly turned his head, scanning his surroundings. He didn't see anything, but he could feel it. A gaze, a presence, someone, or something, was watching them. And deep inside, his instinct screamed that they shouldn't be there. "Annabeth," Percy said, interrupting her speech with a completely serious look. "The symbol of power of the guy from the depths." Annabeth blinked, understanding immediately what he meant. "The helm of darkness," she whispered. "What about it?" "Its power is to become invisible to everyone. To move through walls. To become the darkness itself. That's why everyone fears him," Percy explained, his tone grave. "I'm surprised you know all that, considering you just got to camp and barely seemed to know anything about the Greek gods," said Annabeth, her tone a mix of surprise and curiosity. My mom used to tell me stories about them, Percy replied with a shrug. Though lately, I've started to remember them much more clearly. He paused, glancing around with growing suspicion. But more importantly, who's to say he isn't here right now, watching us from the shadows? How would we even know? Grover's eyes widened, filled with unease. That's impossible to tell, he muttered nervously. Percy sighed, a bit frustrated, and placed his hand near his bag, ready to draw his sword at the slightest sign of danger. The three of them walked together, tense, toward the elevator that would take them to the top of the arch, unaware that the feeling of being watched hadn't left them for even a second. Percy looked inside the elevator for a moment. There, a plump woman and her small dog waited patiently. But when Percy's eyes met hers, something shifted. That feeling he'd had all day, the invisible gaze on his back, the instinct that had kept him on edge, vanished in an instant. The three stepped into the curved elevator, though Percy didn't stop watching the woman. Every muscle in his body stayed tense, every sense on alert. And where are your parents?" the woman suddenly asked, her smile unnerving. Her eyes were pitch black, her teeth, sharp and worn down, the color of rotting brown. She wore a tight-fitting dress that made her look like a human version of the tire mascot, topped with a wide Texan hat. They stayed downstairs," Annabeth replied quickly, improvising with feigned calm. She didn't notice that Percy had quietly slipped his hand into his magic bag, his fingers inching toward his sword, his expression growing more serious by the second. "They're scared of heights," she added, trying to sound convincing. "Oh, poor things," the woman said in a rough, raspy voice, while the small chihuahua in her arms began growling furiously. Its eyes, eerily similar to its owner's, shone with a strange, almost human hatred. "Calm down, my sweet," the woman whispered to her pet, but Percy didn't look away. His gaze flicked between the dog and the woman, studying every detail, waiting for the slightest hostile move. When the elevator reached its highest point, the woman gave them a simple smile before stepping out. Percy followed her with his eyes until she disappeared into the crowd, and only then did he release his grip on his sword inside the bag, letting out a quiet sigh. Maybe he was overreacting, maybe. Annabeth started talking about the arch, its structure, its engineering, its design, pointing out each detail as if reciting from memory. Percy half listened, staring out the tiny windows toward the horizon, though his eyes kept drifting, every so often, to where the woman was now strolling casually, as if the place belonged to her. When it was time to close, the group was guided back toward the elevators. Percy, Grover, and Annabeth waited their turn alongside other tourists. The next elevator was nearly full, so Percy stayed behind, gently pushing his friends forward. "We can wait for you," Annabeth offered, worried. "No, go ahead," Percy said with a calm smile. "I'll see you downstairs." Grover and Annabeth watched him through the elevator doors. Percy's smile seemed perfectly calm, until the doors closed. The moment they did, and the elevator began to descend, that expression vanished, replaced by one of pure seriousness. Without hesitation, Percy spun on his heel, reached into his bag, and drew his sword with near instant speed. At that exact moment, something lunged at him with a deafening roar. A massive lion's head burst from the shadows, jaws wide open, rows of dagger-like teeth glinting. Percy raised his sword just in time, blocking the bite. The blade clashed against the creature's fangs, a spray of sparks lighting up the air as if two metals were grinding together. The impact pushed him back several feet, his shoes screeching against the metal floor. Percy looked up, scanning the creature quickly. It had the body of a lion, but its back ended in a serpent's tail that thrashed wildly. From one side sprouted a goat's leg with cloven hooves, and its skin was a grotesque mix of scales and fur. An impossible monster, yet unmistakably alive. Not far away, the plump woman was watching with a wicked grin. Her forked tongue flicked between her teeth, and beneath the sleeves of her dress, her skin had turned greenish and scaly. Percy felt the creature's immense weight pressing down against his sword, forcing him backward with brutal strength. His arms trembled under the strain, but he held firm, feet digging into the arch's floor. He, feel honored, Percy Jackson," the woman said, her tone dripping with cruel satisfaction. "Lord Zeus rarely allows me to test a hero against one of my own kind." Her voice vibrated with a twisted, almost maternal pride. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Echidna." Percy stared at her, brows furrowed, his sword still locked against the monster's jaws. "Wait, Aren't those a kind of anteater? He asked, dead serious. Echidna's smile vanished, her face twisting into pure rage. And then, the chimera's roar shook the very top of the arch. Want to get ahead in the story? On my Patreon you can read up to 15 chapters in advance and directly support the creation of all my novels. Your help keeps these worlds growing every single day. If you enjoy my work and want to join me a little more, I'll be waiting for you on Patreon. Patreon.com/YoDarki. To be continued.